Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. Story 1. The Tunnel That Echoes and Voices I Know, from Rust Belt Ron. They call me Rust Belt Ron, and I've been hauling freight through the Midwest for close to 30 years now. I've seen every kind of road this country has to offer, from smooth interstate ribbons that stretch toward horizons painted with sunrise colors, to potholed county routes that rattle your teeth loose and make you question every life choice that led you to the cab of an 18-wheeler. I've driven through blizzards that turned the world into a white void where sky and ground became one impossible thing, and I've crawled through summer heat so thick it seemed to have weight and texture, pressing down on the asphalt until it went soft and sticky under my wheels. I've seen deer materialize out of darkness like ghosts made solid just long enough to leap across my headlight beams, and I've watched the sun come up over fields so vast and golden they looked like something out of a painting that nobody would believe was real. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, in all those years and all those miles, prepared me for what happened in that tunnel outside of Wheeling. The one that cuts through the belly of a mountain that's been standing there since long before humans figured out how to make fire or tell stories to each other in the dark. It was late October, the kind of late October where the air itself seems to be holding its breath, waiting for the first real cold snap to come down from Canada and remind everyone that winter is inevitable and patient. The leaves had mostly fallen by then, carpeting the roadside in layers of rust and gold and deep burgundy. And the nights were coming on earlier each day, swallowing the afternoon light with a greediness that felt almost personal. I was running a load of automotive parts from Toledo down to Charlotte. Nothing special or unusual, just another job in a long string of jobs that blurred together into what I'd started thinking of as my life. The route took me through West Virginia, which meant winding roads and elevation changes and tunnels carved through mountains that had stood there watching the world change for millions of years. I'd driven through the Wheeling Tunnel maybe 200 times before, maybe more. It was just another tunnel, just another dark throat of concrete and tile that swallowed you up for maybe 45 seconds before spitting you back out into daylight or darkness, depending on when you went through. I entered the tunnel at about 11:30 at night, which meant traffic was light. Just the occasional set of taillights in the distance, and the even more occasional sweep of headlights coming from the other direction in the opposing lanes. The tunnel itself was lit with those sodium vapor lights that turn everything into shades of orange and gray, making the whole world look like an old photograph that's been left in the sun too long. The sound changed the moment I crossed that threshold from open air into enclosed space, the way it always does. The engine noise got louder, more present, bouncing off the curved walls and coming back at me from all directions. The hiss of air resistance turned into something more complex, a layered rushing that seemed to have depth and dimension. My tires on the pavement went from a steady hum to a deeper thrumming that I could feel in my chest as much as hear with my ears. All of this was normal. All of this was exactly what I expected. And for the first few seconds of that passage through the mountain's hollow core, everything was precisely as it should have been. Then I heard my brother's voice calling my name. My brother Danny, who died in a motorcycle accident 17 years ago on a rain-slicked road outside of Gary, Indiana. His voice is clear and present, as if he were sitting right there in the passenger seat next to me. "Ronnie," he said, using the nickname nobody else had called me since we were kids playing in the ruins of the old steel mill near our house. And the sound of it hit me like a physical thing, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart with a cold hand. I jerked my head to the right, expecting to see nothing because there was nothing to see, but the motion was instinctive and uncontrollable. The passenger seat was empty. Of course it was empty, just shadows and the faint orange glow from the tunnel lights filtering through the window. But the voice came again, bouncing off the tunnel walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Ronnie, you remember that summer we found the bird's nest in the loading crane?" And I did remember. I remembered it with a clarity that seemed impossible after so many years. The way the mama bird would dive at our heads when we climbed up there, The way Danny laughed when I nearly fell trying to dodge her. The way the whole rusty structure of that abandoned crane swayed in the wind. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles going white with the pressure, and I told myself I was imagining things, that the mind does strange things when you've been driving too long, that it was just fatigue, or stress, or maybe the beginning of some kind of breakdown that I'd been putting off dealing with for too long. But then I heard my father's voice, my old man who'd worked himself to death in those same steel mills Danny and I used to explore. Dead from a heart attack while I was on a run to Memphis, and couldn't get back in time to say goodbye. "Boy," he said in that particular way he had, gruff but not unkind. The way he'd addressed me when he wanted to tell me something important, but didn't quite know how to put it into words, and I felt something cold and electric run down my spine like water made of ice and lightning. The tunnel seemed longer now, stretching ahead of me farther than it should have. The lights receding into an orange distance that didn't match my memory of how long this passage through the mountain was supposed to take. I checked my speedometer, and I was doing 55, exactly what I should be doing, exactly the speed limit posted on the signs at the tunnel entrance. But the far end of the tunnel, that circle of darkness or light, depending on what waited on the other side, seemed to be pulling away from me, staying just out of reach, no matter how far I traveled. And the voices kept coming, echoing off those curved walls, layering over each other in a chorus of people I'd known and lost. I heard my grandmother, who'd taught me how to make pierogi from scratch, and who'd told me stories about the old country, in a mixture of English and Polish that made the past seem like a real place you could visit, if you just knew the right roads to take. I heard my first dog, Rex, barking the way he used to when I'd come home from school, and even though I knew dogs couldn't talk, couldn't call my name in human words, I heard him doing exactly that, his voice mixed with the others in an impossible symphony of memory and loss. "What do you want?" I finally said out loud, my voice sounding strange and small in the cab of my truck, nearly swallowed by the engine noise and the rushing air and the endless echoing of those other voices that shouldn't exist. "What are you trying to tell me?" The voices didn't answer my question directly, didn't give me any kind of clear message, or warning, or explanation. Instead, they just kept talking, saying things they'd said when they were alive, remembering moments we'd shared, speaking in fragments of conversations I'd nearly forgotten. My Uncle Stan talking about the time he won $50 on a horse named Thunder's Chance. My mother, dead from cancer when I was 19, humming the melody of a lullaby she used to sing when I couldn't sleep during summer thunderstorms. My best friend from high school, Charlie, who'd moved to California and who I'd lost touch with decades ago, though I didn't even know if he was dead or alive, laughing about the time we'd convinced ourselves we could fix up an old Camaro and drive it to the coast. Never mind that neither of us knew the first thing about engine repair. The tunnel walls seemed to be moving, not in any obvious way, but with a subtle breathing motion, expanding and contracting like the tunnel itself was alive, like I'd been swallowed by something massive and ancient that was digesting me slowly, extracting memories and turning them into echoes. I thought about stopping, about pulling over to the narrow shoulder that ran along the tunnel's edge, but something deep and instinctive told me that stopping would be a mistake, that I needed to keep moving forward, no matter what, that the only way out was through. So I maintained my speed, kept my hands on the wheel, and listened to the voices of everyone I'd ever loved and lost bouncing around in that enclosed space, turning the tunnel into a gallery of ghosts, a museum of moments I'd thought were buried safely in the past where they couldn't hurt me anymore. Then, gradually, so gradually I almost didn't notice at first, the voices began to fade. They didn't stop all at once, didn't cut off sharply or dramatically. Instead, they just grew quieter, more distant, like people walking away from me down a long hallway. Their words becoming indistinct, their presence becoming memory, instead of something immediate and present. The tunnel walls stopped their subtle breathing motion and became just walls again, concrete and tile stained with exhaust and years of use. The lights stopped seeming to recede and instead passed overhead at their normal intervals, marking my progress through the mountain's heart in regular, measurable increments. And finally, After what felt like hours, but what my clock told me was only about 3 minutes total, I saw the tunnel's exit approaching, that circle of darkness that would open up into the West Virginia night, and I accelerated slightly, eager to be free of that enclosed space and back under open sky, where the world made sense again. When I emerged from the tunnel, everything was exactly as it should have been. The road stretched ahead of me, winding down into a valley where scattered lights marked houses and small towns. The night air was cool and clean when I cracked my window, nothing but the smell of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke. My CB radio crackled with the occasional transmission from other drivers, talking about traffic conditions and weather reports and which rest stops had the best coffee. Everything was normal, everything was as it should be, except for the fact that I was shaking, my hands trembling on the wheel, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps, like I'd just run a race or narrowly avoided a collision. I drove for another hour before I pulled into a rest stop, one of those big truck plazas with diesel pumps, and a restaurant that never closes and showers you can rent for 15 minutes of hot water and temporary privacy. I parked in a space far from the building, away from the other trucks and the pools of artificial light, and I just sat there in the darkness of my cab, trying to make sense of what had happened. I thought about calling someone, maybe my sister who still lived in Gary, maybe one of the few friends I'd managed to keep over the years, despite my nomadic existence. But what would I say? That I'd heard the voices of dead people in a tunnel, that the past had reached out and touched me through sound waves bouncing off concrete. It sounded crazy even in my own head, and I'd been the one who experienced it. Eventually, I got out of the cab and walked around my truck, checking tires and lights and connections, doing all the routine things that gave my hands something to do and my mind something to focus on besides questions I couldn't answer. The night was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic on the interstate and the hum of refrigeration units on other trucks. The stars were out, scattered across the sky in patterns that had been there long before I was born and would be there long after I was gone, indifferent to human concerns, indifferent to the strangeness of existence. I looked back in the direction I'd come from, back toward where that tunnel carved through the mountain, and I wondered if other drivers had experienced what I had, if there were stories out there that people didn't tell because they sounded too impossible, too much like the ravings of someone who'd been on the road too long. I've driven through that tunnel maybe 100 times since that night, and it's never happened again. The tunnel is just a tunnel now, 45 seconds of enclosed space, and sodium vapor lights, and the normal acoustics of concrete and tile. But I remember, and I always will remember, the night when everyone I'd lost came back to speak to me in voices that echoed off those walls, saying things they'd said in life, reminding me of moments I'd thought were safely buried in the past. I don't know what it meant, if it meant anything at all. Maybe it was just my brain's way of processing grief, of bringing up old losses so I could examine them one more time, and then finally let them go. Maybe it was something else, something stranger and less explicable, some thin place where the past and present overlap, and the dead can reach through for just a moment to remind the living that they were real, that they mattered, that they're not forgotten. They call me Rust Belt Ron, and I haul freight through the Midwest. And I've got a story about a tunnel that I don't tell very often, because most people wouldn't believe it, and the ones who would believe it would probably worry about my mental state. But it happened, as surely as I'm sitting here now, as surely as I'll get back in my truck tomorrow and drive another 1,000 miles toward another destination that's just a name on a map. It happened, and I carry it with me. One more memory added to all the others, one more strange thing filed away in the catalog of experiences that make up a life spent on the road, watching the world roll by through the windshield, listening to the voices of the past echoing in places where they shouldn't be heard, and wondering what it all means in the end. Story 2. The Rest Stop Where My Reflection Blinks Late, from Silent Steve. They call me Silent Steve, a name that stuck back when I first started driving, back when I was young enough to think that being quiet made you mysterious, instead of just antisocial. I got the name because I never talked much on the CB. never joined in the constant chatter that fills the airwaves during long hauls. The jokes and warnings and complaints that other drivers use to fight off the loneliness of the road. I preferred the silence, the long stretches of pavement and sky, where the only sounds were the engine and the tires, and my own thoughts turning over and over, like a wheel that never stops spinning. I've been hauling freight for close to 25 years now, running loads from the Pacific Northwest down through California, and sometimes across to Nevada and Arizona, following routes that take me through forests so thick they seem to swallow light, across deserts where the heat makes the horizon shimmer like water, past mountain ranges that look like the spine of some massive sleeping creature. I've seen dawn break over the Cascades in colors that don't have names and watched storms roll across the Great Basin like advancing armies made of cloud and lightning. But for all the miles I've covered and all the strange things I've witnessed in the deep hours of night, when the world feels thin and anything seems possible, nothing prepared me for what happened at that rest stop outside of Redding. It was early March, that time of year in Northern California, when winter hasn't quite given up its grip, but spring is starting to push through anyway, making the weather unpredictable and the roads occasionally treacherous with unexpected rain or even snow at higher elevations. I was hauling a load of electronics from Seattle down to Sacramento. Running the I-5 corridor that I'd driven so many times, I could probably do it in my sleep. Which is a dangerous thought, but one that comes to all drivers eventually when you've covered the same ground enough times that it stops being a journey and starts being a routine. The day had been long but uneventful, just steady driving through gray skies that couldn't decide whether to rain or just threaten it, past the endless sequence of towns and truck stops and agricultural inspection stations that marked the passage south through Oregon and into California. By the time I reached the rest stop, it was well past midnight, sliding into that dead zone of early morning when even the most dedicated night owls have usually given up and gone to bed. When the world feels empty and abandoned, like everyone else has disappeared and you're the only person left, driving through a landscape of ghosts and memories. The rest stop was one of those standard California Department of Transportation facilities. Nothing fancy, just a parking lot and bathroom building and some picnic tables set under trees that looked black and skeletal against the dark blue of the pre-dawn sky. There were maybe 3 or 4 other trucks scattered around the lot, their running lights glowing softly, their drivers presumably asleep in their cabs, or maybe inside using the facilities, or stretching their legs before the next push down the road. I pulled into a space far from the bathroom building, my usual preference, and shut down the engine, letting the sudden silence wash over me like a physical thing. After hours of constant noise, the quiet always feels profound, almost sacred, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant sound of traffic on the interstate. I sat there for a moment, just breathing, feeling the tension drain out of my shoulders and back. All those muscles that had been holding me upright and alert for the past 6 hours finally getting permission to relax. Then I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab, my boots hitting the pavement with a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness, and started walking toward the bathroom building. The building was typical of its kind, concrete block construction painted in some institutional beige that looked gray in the weak lighting, with separate entrances for men and women, and the usual post-it notices about keeping the facilities clean and not staying longer than the posted time limits. The lights inside were inactivated, fluorescent tubes that hummed and flickered when I pushed through the door, casting everything in that peculiar greenish-white glow that makes everyone look slightly sick and washes out all color 2 shades of gray. The floor was damp, recently mopped, or maybe just accumulating condensation from the cool night air, and my boots squeaked against the tile as I walked toward the row of sinks. That's when I saw my reflection in the mirror, which shouldn't have been noteworthy because mirrors show reflections. That's their entire purpose. That's what they're designed to do. But something about it caught my attention, made me stop and look more carefully, though I couldn't have said exactly what had triggered that response. My reflection looked back at me, a tired-looking man in his late 40s, with a few days' worth of stubble and eyes that had seen too many sunrises from behind the wheel of a truck, and not enough from anywhere else. Everything seemed normal, everything seemed exactly as it should be, and I was just about to turn away and attend to the business that had brought me into the bathroom in the first place, when my reflection blinked. Now, I know what you're thinking, because I thought it too. Reflections blink when you blink. That's how they work. They mirror your actions instantaneously, because that's the nature of reflected light. But here's the thing that made my stomach drop and my skin go cold, despite the stuffy warmth of the bathroom. I hadn't blinked. I was standing there, staring at my reflection, my eyes wide open and starting to dry out from the stale air, and my reflection's eyes closed and opened in a slow, deliberate blink that I absolutely did not perform. The motion was slight, barely noticeable, the kind of quick eye movement that happens thousands of times a day, without conscious thought, but in that moment it stood out like a scream in a silent room, impossible and wrong, and completely undeniable. I froze, every muscle in my body going tight, my breathing suddenly shallow and rapid. Fight or flight instincts kicking in even though there was nothing physical to fight or flee from. Just my own image in a bathroom mirror, doing something it shouldn't be able to do. I stared at my reflection, and my reflection stared back, and for several long seconds, nothing happened. The fluorescent lights continued their quiet humming, the ventilation fan rattled in its housing, water dripped somewhere in one of the stalls behind me, all normal sounds that did nothing to dispel the absolute wrongness of what I'd just witnessed. Then, as I watched, frozen and unable to look away, my reflection's mouth moved slightly, the corners turning up in a smile that I could feel was not present on my actual face, a smile that looked knowing and somehow mocking, like the reflection was in on some joke that I hadn't been told yet. I stepped back, my boots squeaking on the wet floor, putting distance between myself and the mirror, even though I knew intellectually that distance didn't matter, that a reflection is just light bouncing off a surface and has no physical presence or agency. But the primitive part of my brain, the part that still believes in predators hiding in darkness and malevolent spirits inhabiting the shadows, insisted that I needed to get away, needed to break the connection between me and that image that was no longer behaving like a proper reflection should. I turned away quickly, facing the door, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was fatigue, maybe I'd been driving so long that my brain was starting to malfunction, seeing things that weren't there, creating patterns and movements out of random visual noise. Maybe it was a trick of the fluorescent lighting, some weird effect of the flickering bulbs that made it seem like movement when there was none. Maybe I had blinked and just didn't remember doing it, some kind of momentary fugue state where seconds of time disappeared and my brain filled in the gaps with false memories. But even as I tried to explain it away, I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it wasn't any of those things. My reflection had moved independently, had blinked when I hadn't blinked, had smiled when I wasn't smiling, and no amount of rationalization was going to change that fundamental fact. I stood there facing the door, listening to my own rapid breathing, trying to decide what to do next. The sensible thing would be to just leave, to walk back to my truck and drive away, and chalk the whole thing up to road fatigue and stress, and the strange things that happen when you spend too much time alone with your thoughts. But something stubborn in me, some part of my personality that had always insisted on confronting things directly rather than running away, made me turn around. My reflection was waiting for me, standing in exactly the position I was standing in, mirroring my posture and stance perfectly now, as if the previous aberration had never happened. I stared at it, and it stared back, and everything seemed normal again. I raised my right hand slowly, watching the reflection raise its left hand in perfect synchronization. I tilted my head to the side, and the reflection tilted its head in the opposite direction, exactly as it should. I took a step forward, and the reflection took a step forward. Our movements matched precisely. No delay, no variation. Everything was as it should be, following the laws of physics and optics that govern how light and mirrors work. Then, I blinked deliberately, closing my eyes and opening them again, and I watched my reflection carefully to make sure it blinked at exactly the same moment. It did. I blinked again, faster this time, and the reflection matched me perfectly. I started to feel foolish, standing there in a rest stop bathroom in the middle of the night. having a staring contest with my own mirror image, testing whether reality worked the way it was supposed to work. But just as I was about to turn away again, just as I was about to dismiss the whole thing as a hallucination or a trick of exhausted perception, my reflection blinked 3 times in rapid succession while my eyes stayed wide open, and then it winked at me, a slow, deliberate closing and opening of its right eye, while its left eye remained open, staring at me with an intensity that felt almost accusatory. I backed toward the door, without taking my eyes off the mirror, moving purely by feel, my hand reaching behind me to find the door handle, while I watched my reflection match my backward movement. Except for the eyes, those eyes that kept doing things independently, blinking and winking, and at one point rolling upward, like the reflection was trying to see something on the ceiling that I couldn't see. When my hand finally found the cold metal of the door handle, I yanked it down and pushed through the door, stumbling out into the night air that felt shockingly cold after the enclosed warmth of the bathroom. I let the door swing shut behind me and stood there in the weak light from the overhead lamps, breathing hard, my hands shaking, my entire body trembling with adrenaline and fear and a profound sense of wrongness that I couldn't shake. I looked around the parking lot, half expecting to see something else strange or impossible, but everything appeared normal. The other trucks sat where they'd been before, dark and quiet. The picnic tables cast long shadows under the sodium vapor lights. The trees rustled softly in a breeze I could barely feel. The distant sound of traffic on the interstate provided a constant white noise backdrop, a reminder that the world was still turning, still operating according to its normal rules, despite what I'd just experienced inside that bathroom. I started walking back toward my truck, moving quickly, but trying not to run, not wanting to give in completely to the panic that was clawing at my chest and throat. When I reached my truck, I climbed into the cab and locked the doors immediately, which was stupid because what was I locking them against? A reflection that couldn't leave a mirror. But the action made me feel slightly safer anyway, gave me the illusion of control and protection. I sat in the driver's seat in the darkness, not wanting to turn on any lights, just watching the bathroom building from a distance, half expecting to see something emerge from it, though I couldn't have said what that something might be. Minutes passed, then maybe a quarter hour, and nothing happened. The rest stop remained quiet and still, just another ordinary place where tired drivers could take a break from the road. Nothing supernatural or threatening about it at all, except for my racing heart and the memory of those eyes blinking out of sync with mine. I should have started the engine and driven away right then, but I was exhausted, and the next real truck stop with secure parking was still more than an hour down the road, and part of me was already trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. So I reclined my seat and pulled a blanket over myself and told myself I'd just rest for an hour or two, just long enough to take the edge off my fatigue, and then I'd continue down to Sacramento and forget any of this had happened. Sleep came surprisingly quickly, maybe because my body was just that tired, maybe because my mind wanted to escape from the questions and implications of what I'd witnessed. I dropped into unconsciousness like a stone falling into deep water, and I didn't dream, or at least I didn't remember dreaming when I woke up 3 hours later to find morning light filtering through my windshield and the rest stop considerably more populated with trucks and cars as the early morning travelers started their days. I sat up, feeling the stiffness in my neck and back from sleeping in an awkward position, and looked toward the bathroom building. In the daylight, it looked completely innocent, just a standard concrete structure, nothing sinister or strange about it at all. I debated whether to go back inside, whether to check the mirrors again to see if anything unusual happened in the clear light of morning, but I decided against it. Some things, I figured, are better left alone, better left as mysteries that don't need solving. I started my engine, checked my mirrors, the normal mirrors on my truck that showed me the normal world behind me, with no strange behavior or independent movement, and I pulled out of the rest stop and back onto the interstate, continuing my journey south toward Sacramento. I've stopped at that rest stop maybe a dozen times since then, always during daylight hours, always making sure I'm not there during that dead zone of early morning when the world feels thin and strange. I've used the bathroom there, washed my hands in those same sinks, and glanced at my reflection in those mirrors, and everything has always been completely normal. My reflection does exactly what it's supposed to do, mirroring my movements with perfect precision. No delays, no independent actions, no knowing smiles, or out-of-sync blinking. But I remember that night, and I always will, and sometimes when I'm looking in a mirror anywhere, not just at that rest stop, but anywhere at all, I find myself watching a little more carefully, paying attention to whether my reflection is doing exactly what I'm doing at exactly the same moment, because now I know that sometimes, for reasons I can't explain or understand, the reflection might have ideas of its own. They call me Silent Steve, and I drive these roads with my thoughts for company. And I've got a story about a mirror that I don't tell very often, because it sounds crazy, and because most people would assume I was just overtired, or hallucinating, or making the whole thing up for attention. But it happened. As surely as I'm here now, as surely as I'll see my reflection 1,000 more times before I'm done with this life. It happened, and it changed the way I look at mirrors, changed the way I think about reflections, and what they might or might not be, because maybe a reflection is just light bouncing off a surface. Nothing more, and nothing less. Just physics doing what physics does. Or maybe, just maybe, there's something else going on, something we don't understand, some layer of reality that sometimes bleeds through in the dead hours of night, when the world is quiet, and the barriers between things are thinner than they should be. I don't know which is true, and I'm not sure I want to know, but I remember, and I watch, and I drive. Story 3. The CB frequency full of breathing. From Rusty Joe. They call me Rusty Joe, a name that started as a joke about my ancient truck that seemed to accumulate rust faster than I could sand it off and repaint it, but eventually became just what everyone knew me as, a handle that stuck the way these things do out here on the road. I've been driving for the better part of 40 years now, hauling everything from produce to heavy machinery across every state in the lower 48, and even up into Canada. A few times when the money was right, and the weather cooperated. I've seen the trucking industry change in ways both good and bad, watched as technology transformed the cab from a simple steering wheel and dashboard into something that looks more like a spaceship cockpit, filled with screens and sensors and computers that monitor every aspect of the vehicle's performance. But through all those changes, through all the modernization and digitization, one thing has remained constant. One piece of technology that's been with me since my very first run as a nervous 23-year-old kid who could barely double clutch without grinding gears, and that's my CB radio. The CB has been my companion, my lifeline, my connection to the community of drivers who share these roads. It's how we warn each other about speed traps and accidents, how we share information about good places to eat and bad places to park, how we fight off the loneliness of long hauls with jokes and stories and the kind of casual conversation that makes the miles pass more quickly. I've heard every kind of transmission you can imagine come through that speaker over the years, from the mundane to the bizarre, from helpful warnings about black ice to philosophical discussions about the nature of existence that somehow spring up at 3 in the morning when everyone's tired enough to get existential. I've heard people sing, heard them pray, heard them confess things to the anonymous audience of the airwaves that they probably wouldn't tell their closest friends. The CB is its own world, its own culture, with its own rules and rhythms and ways of being, and I've been a part of that world for so long that I can't imagine driving without it. But last spring, running a load of industrial equipment from Houston up to Kansas City, I heard something on the CB that I can't explain, something that still makes me check the channel more carefully than I used to. Still makes me hesitate before I key the mic and add my own voice to the constant flow of communication that fills Channel 19 during busy hours. It was late April, that perfect time of year, in the southern plains, when winter is definitely gone, but summer heat hasn't yet arrived, when the wildflowers turn the roadside into something that looks like an impressionist painting all yellow and purple and orange, when thunderstorms build up in the afternoons, and light shows play across the horizon at dusk. I'd left Houston around 6 in the evening, planning to drive through the night and most of the next day to make my delivery window in Kansas City, A straight shot up through Texas into Oklahoma, and then across into Kansas. A route I'd driven dozens of times. A route I'd driven dozens of times. A route I'd driven dozens of nussets, or outside no, I'd out, and met Evan with a prior to band a map and in where it's a bit in it and but the first few hours were completely normal. Just me and the road and the steady stream of CB chatter that provided background noise and occasional useful information. Drivers called out their positions, warned about construction zones, complained about the car drivers who didn't understand how much space a loaded 18-wheeler needs to stop safely. Someone told a joke about a priest and a rabbi that I'd heard at least 50 times before, but that still got a few laughs from the audience of drivers scattered across hundreds of miles of highway. Someone else was trying to sell a load of watermelons that had been rejected at a distribution center, offering them at a steep discount to anyone who wanted to make a detour. It was all standard stuff, the usual symphony of voices that fills the airwaves, and I found it comforting in the way that familiar things are comforting. A reminder that I wasn't alone out here, that there was a whole community of people doing exactly what I was doing, moving goods across the country in the dark hours when most people are asleep, somewhere around 11 o'clock, after I'd crossed into Oklahoma and was making good time on a clear stretch of highway with a 3/4 moon, providing enough light to see the landscape rolling past in shades of silver and gray. The chatter on the CB started to die down. This wasn't unusual, as the late hours tend to be quieter, with fewer drivers on the road, and those who are out there often choosing silence over conversation as fatigue sets in and energy for socializing depletes. The occasional transmission still came through, but the frequency was definitely quieter than it had been earlier. Long stretches of static interrupted by brief exchanges that were more functional than social. I was fine with the quiet, actually preferred it at that point, as I was settling into that meditative state that long-distance drivers know well, where the mind wanders and processes and thinks about everything and nothing while the body handles the mechanical tasks of driving almost automatically. That's when I first heard the breathing. It was quiet at first, barely audible under the hiss and crackle of radio static. Just a soft, rhythmic sound that could have been mistaken for wind noise or interference from some other electronic source. But there was something about the pattern of it, something about the regularity and the organic quality of the sound that made me pay attention, that made me turn up the volume on my CB slightly and listen more carefully. It was definitely breathing, human breathing, someone inhaling and exhaling in a slow, steady rhythm, and they were keying their mic without saying anything, just broadcasting the sound of their respiration out across the airwaves for everyone to hear. Now, this kind of thing isn't completely unheard of on the CB. Sometimes people accidentally key their mic and don't realize it, broadcasting whatever ambient noise is happening in their cab until someone else breaks in and tells them they're transmitting. Sometimes it's kids playing with their parents' CB equipment, thinking it's funny to make noise and disrupt the channel. Sometimes it's just weird behavior from strange people, the kind of low-level trolling that happens in any public communication space. So my first reaction wasn't alarm, just mild annoyance, and I waited for someone else to say something, to tell whoever it was to check their mic or get off the channel if they weren't going to talk. But nobody said anything, and the breathing continued, filling the spaces between other transmissions. Sometimes loud enough to completely dominate the channel, sometimes fading back into the static, but never disappearing completely. It went on for maybe 10 minutes, just that steady breathing, in and out, with a rhythm that was somehow wrong, just slightly off from what normal breathing should sound like, either too fast or too slow or too deep. I couldn't quite pinpoint what made it disturbing, but it definitely was. I found myself breathing along with it unconsciously, my own respiration matching the pattern coming through the speaker. And when I realized I was doing that, I forced myself to breathe differently, to break the synchronization, and the effort it took to do that made me uneasy in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Finally, someone else noticed and said something about it. A driver with a Tennessee accent asking if someone's mic was stuck or if they were having some kind of emergency. The breathing stopped immediately, cut off mid-inhale, like whoever was doing it had released their mic button, and for a few seconds there was just normal static and the resumed murmur of other drivers having normal conversations about normal things. I felt a sense of relief, assuming that whoever had been making the noise had either realized their mistake or had been embarrassed into stopping by the public call-out. But my relief was short-lived because maybe 5 minutes later, the breathing started again. Same slow rhythm, same slightly wrong quality that made my skin prickle and my hands tighten on the steering wheel. This time more people commented on it, asking whoever it was to please get off the channel, saying it was creepy and disruptive, and asking if anyone could triangulate where the transmission was coming from. One driver, sounding genuinely concerned, asked if the person breathing was okay, if they needed help, if maybe they were having a medical emergency and couldn't speak. But there was never any response beyond the breathing itself, which continued its steady pattern, sometimes seeming to get louder, sometimes fading slightly, but never stopping completely for more than a minute or two at a time. The normal chatter on the CB was being interrupted constantly, people having to talk over the breathing or wait for pauses to get their messages across, and you could hear the frustration building in people's voices as they tried to maintain their usual communication patterns despite the intrusion. I kept driving, trying to focus on the road and ignore the increasingly unsettling sound coming from my CB speaker. But it was difficult because the breathing had a presence to it, an almost physical quality, like whoever was doing it was right there in the cab with me, exhaling cold air onto the back of my neck. I reached over at one point and changed channels, moving from 19 to other frequencies to see if I could escape it. But on every channel I tried, after a few seconds the breathing would start again, following me, finding me, making it impossible to get away from that sound. I thought about turning the CB off completely, just shutting down that whole avenue of communication and driving in silence. But something stubborn in me refused to do that, refused to let this weird intrusion drive me off the airwaves that I'd been using for 40 years. Around 1 in the morning, during a particularly long stretch of breathing with no interruption from other drivers, I did something I'm not entirely sure was wise. I keyed my own mic, and in a calm voice that I didn't entirely feel, I said, "Whoever's doing the breathing, this is Rusty Joe, and I'm asking you politely to please stop, or at least tell us what you need. If you're in some kind of trouble, we can try to help, but you've got to communicate something more than just breathing." I released the mic and waited, half expecting no response, or maybe more breathing, or possibly a laugh, if this was all just somebody's idea of a prank. What I got instead was a voice, barely above a whisper, distorted by distance, or poor equipment, or maybe intentional alteration, saying, "Can't stop, won't stop, shouldn't stop. Listen to the breath, hear the message in the pattern. Count the spaces between." The voice had no particular accent that I could identify. Could have been male or female, young or old, impossible to tell from those few words filtered through radio static. Then the breathing resumed immediately, and now that I was listening for it, now that I'd been told there was a pattern, I started to actually count the intervals, timing the inhales and exhales, trying to figure out if there was some kind of code hidden in the rhythm. At first I couldn't find anything. The breathing seemed random, irregular intervals between each breath, no obvious pattern or structure that I could detect. But I kept listening, kept counting, and gradually something started to emerge, though I wasn't sure if it was real or if I was just imposing pattern on randomness the way the human brain is prone to do, finding meaning where none exists. The breathing seemed to be grouped in sets, long pauses followed by several quick breaths, then another long pause, the arrangement varying, but with a structure that felt intentional. I tried to map it to Morse code, thinking maybe someone was sending an SOS or some other distress signal. But if it was Morse code, it wasn't any sequence I recognized. Other drivers were still commenting on it periodically, their messages now taking on a slightly desperate quality, asking why nobody from the FCC or Highway Patrol was doing anything about this disruption, asking if anyone had called in to report it, speculating about who or what might be behind it. One driver, sounding frightened, said he was turning his CB off entirely because the breathing was giving him nightmares. Another said he'd switched to a different channel, and the breathing had followed him there too, which matched my own experience. The situation had gone from annoying to disturbing to genuinely frightening, at least for some of us, though there were also drivers who seemed to think the whole thing was hilarious, making jokes about heavy breathers and obscene phone calls, and asking if anyone had checked whether Darth Vader had taken up trucking. The breathing continued for another hour, maybe more, dominating the channel, making normal communication nearly impossible, creating an atmosphere of unease that spread across the airwaves like a fog rolling in from the coast. I drove through it, maintaining my speed, checking my mirrors, doing all the normal things a driver does, but part of my attention was always on that sound, always listening to that steady rhythm, always trying to figure out what it meant or what message might be hidden in it. At one point, I convinced myself I could hear words in the breathing, actual whispered words tucked into the exhales, but when I focused on trying to make them out, they dissolved into nonsense, or maybe I was just hearing what I wanted to hear, finding language in what was just air moving in and out of lungs. Then, at approximately 2:30 in the morning, according to my dashboard clock, the breathing changed. It got faster, more urgent, the inhales becoming sharp gasps, like someone running or in pain. The exhales turning into something almost like moans or cries. The change was dramatic enough that several drivers immediately commented on it, asking again if someone was having a medical emergency, if we should be calling for help, if anyone knew where this transmission might be originating from. The breathing reached a crescendo, fast and desperate and terrible to listen to, and then it cut off completely, mid-gasp, leaving only silence and static. The CB stayed quiet for several long minutes, none of us saying anything. All of us just waiting to see if the breathing would resume, or if whatever had been happening was finally over. When someone finally did speak, it was just to say, well, that was the weirdest thing I've heard in 30 years of driving. And there was a murmur of agreement from multiple drivers up and down the channel. Someone else said they were definitely filing a complaint when they got to their next stop. Another person suggested we all just forget about it and move on, that dwelling on weirdness only makes it feel more significant than it probably was. I continued driving through the night, and the CB stayed mostly normal after that. The usual mix of voices and information, and casual conversation, no more breathing or strange transmissions. But I found it hard to concentrate, hard to settle back into that meditative driving state I'd been in before the whole thing started. My mind kept going back to it, kept trying to understand what I'd heard, and what it might have meant, if it meant anything at all. Was it someone's idea of a prank? Was it performance art of some bizarre kind? Was it someone having a genuine mental health crisis? Was it something else entirely? Something I didn't have the framework to understand or explain. I never heard anything like it again, and in the months since, I've asked other drivers if they've experienced similar things, and some say yes. They've heard strange transmissions on the CB before, unexplained sounds or voices that don't make sense, while others say no, nothing like that has ever happened to them. The CB is mostly back to being the familiar tool and companion it's always been, filled with normal human voices discussing normal human concerns, helping each other out, passing the time during long hauls. But sometimes, usually in those quiet late-night hours, when traffic is sparse and the world feels a little less solid than it does in daylight, I listen more carefully than I used to, paying attention to the spaces between transmissions, wondering if I might hear that breathing again, wondering if whoever or whatever was behind it is still out there somewhere, keying a mic and breathing into the void, sending a message that none of us can quite decipher. They call me Rusty Joe, and I've been on these roads for longer than I care to admit. And I've got a story about a CB radio and a sound that shouldn't have been there. Most people I tell this story to just shrug and say it was probably just some troublemaker, or a CB glitch, or atmospheric conditions causing weird reception. And maybe they're right. Maybe there's a perfectly rational explanation for what I heard that night. But I remember the way it sounded. Remember the way it made me feel. Remember the wrongness of that rhythm, and the voice that whispered about patterns and messages hidden in breath. And I remember that I still don't know what it meant. Story 4. The Shadow That Drives Beside Me. From Outlaw Owen. They call me Outlaw Owen, though I'm about as far from an outlaw as you can get. Never even gotten a speeding ticket in all my years on the road. Never hauled anything illegal. Never cheated on my logs, or pushed past the legal driving hours. Always played by the rules, even when it cost me time or money. I got the name because when I first started driving back in the early 90s, I had long hair and a leather jacket, and a general attitude that made me look like I might be the kind of guy who didn't follow rules, even though nothing could have been further from the truth. The name stuck anyway, the way these things do, and eventually I stopped correcting people and just accepted that this is what I'm known as, out here, Outlaw Owen. The most law-abiding driver on the interstate system. I've been hauling freight for 32 years now, mostly running the southern routes, Texas to Florida, to Louisiana, to Georgia, and everywhere in between, carrying everything from furniture to livestock, to refrigerated goods that have to be kept at exact temperatures, or they'll spoil and cost someone a fortune. I know these roads the way some people know their own neighborhoods. Every exit and rest stop and way station, every stretch where you can push a little harder, and every stretch where you need to be careful, because the state police run radar constantly. I've driven through hurricanes and heat waves, and that one crazy February when Texas froze over and the whole transportation system ground to a halt. Through it all, I've maintained my reputation as steady, reliable, and completely by the book. A driver you can count on to deliver on time and undamaged, every single time. But last October, running a load of commercial refrigeration equipment from Dallas down to New Orleans, something happened that I still don't fully understand. Something that made me question my own perception, and made me wonder if maybe there are things out there on these roads that can't be explained by logic or reason, or the normal rules of how reality is supposed to work. It started on the second night of what was supposed to be a 3-day haul, normal timing for that route. Nothing rushed or particularly challenging about it. I'd spent the day making steady progress across East Texas, through Tyler and Longview and Marshall, watching the landscape gradually shift from the dry plains around Dallas to the piney woods that eventually give way to Louisiana bayou country. The weather was perfect for driving, clear skies and mild temperatures, the kind of October evening when the air feels crisp and fresh and full of possibility. Traffic was light as the sun went down, just the occasional car or truck passing in the other direction, everyone maintaining a comfortable speed, no congestion or construction to slow things down. I'd pulled off for dinner at a truck stop, just inside the Louisiana border. One of those big travel plazas, with multiple restaurant options, and a store that sells everything from CB equipment to cowboy boots. I'd eaten a decent meal, stretched my legs with a walk around the parking lot, and topped off my fuel tank, even though I probably had enough to make it to my next planned stop. But I'm the kind of driver who likes to have a full tank whenever possible, likes the psychological comfort of knowing I've got range and options if something unexpected comes up. By the time I got back on the road, it was fully dark, somewhere around 8:30 at night, and I settled in for the evening portion of my drive, with a cup of coffee from the truck stop that was too hot to drink, but that would gradually cool to the perfect temperature by the time I'd covered another 50 miles. The highway stretched ahead of me, I-20, cutting a straight line through pine forests that crowded right up to the shoulder, their silhouettes dark against a sky that still held the faintest glow of sunset in the west. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating white lane markers and occasional reflective road signs, but leaving everything beyond their reach in shadow. The interior of my cab was lit by the soft glow of dashboard lights and the greenish illumination from my CB radio, creating a bubble of familiarity and warmth that contrasted with the vast darkness outside. I had the radio on, tuned to some classic country station out of Shreveport, Merle Haggard, or George Jones, or one of those old voices that seem to understand loneliness and long distances better than anything contemporary ever could. That's when I first noticed the headlights beside me. They appeared in my left-hand mirror, another vehicle matching my speed almost perfectly, staying just slightly behind me, maintaining a constant position in the next lane over. This isn't particularly unusual on the highway, as drivers often end up pacing each other, especially when everyone's using cruise control set to similar speeds. But there was something about these lights that caught my attention, something that made me glance at them more than once, though I couldn't have said exactly what it was. They weren't particularly bright or dim, weren't an unusual color or configuration, just a normal set of headlights from what appeared to be another large vehicle, probably another semi, though I couldn't make out any details beyond the lights themselves. I maintained my speed, staying in the right lane like you're supposed to when you're not actively passing, and I expected the other vehicle to either speed up and pass me or slow down and drop back. The way these temporary pairings usually resolve themselves naturally, but the lights stayed right there, maintaining that exact position just slightly behind me and one lane over, close enough that I could see them constantly in my mirror, but far enough back that they weren't tailgating or being aggressive. Miles passed, maybe 10 or 15, and the lights didn't change position at all, didn't creep forward or fall back, just held that same spot like the driver had locked onto me somehow, and was determined to stay right there. I tried speeding up slightly, pressing the accelerator and watching my speedometer climb from 65 to 70, and the lights matched my acceleration perfectly, maintaining that same relative position. I tried slowing down, easing off the throttle, and letting gravity and rolling resistance bring my speed down to 60, and again the lights matched me, adjusting their speed to stay in that exact same spot. It was like whoever was driving that vehicle was focused entirely on me, on maintaining this precise geometric relationship, and the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became, though I couldn't have articulated exactly why. It's not like they were threatening me or doing anything dangerous, they were just there, constant and unchanging, a presence that refused to resolve itself into either a passing maneuver or a falling back. I tried to get a better look at the vehicle in my mirror, adjusting the angle, leaning forward and back to change my perspective. But I couldn't make out any details beyond the headlights themselves. The darkness seemed to swallow everything else, leaving just those 2 points of light hovering in the blackness beside me. I couldn't see the outline of a cab or trailer, couldn't see any marker lights or running lights that would indicate the shape and size of the vehicle. Couldn't even really gauge how far away it was, because distance becomes weird and hard to judge in mirror reflections at night, when all you have to go on is lights without context. After maybe 20 more miles of this, I started to get genuinely bothered by it. That low-level anxiety building in my chest that comes when something is wrong, but you can't quite identify what or why. I keyed my CB and said, "Hey," to the driver pacing me in the left lane here on I-20 eastbound around mile marker 138. "You planning on passing, or you just enjoy the view from back there?" I tried to keep my tone light, joking, not wanting to sound paranoid or hostile, just a friendly driver-to-driver question about intentions. No response came through the CB, just the usual crackle of static, and the distant murmur of other drivers having conversations that had nothing to do with me. I waited a few seconds and tried again, saying, "Seriously, driver beside me in the left lane, are you there? Your radio working?" Still nothing, just silence from whoever was operating that vehicle with the lights that wouldn't leave me alone. I felt my unease deepen, shifting from mild irritation into something closer to actual fear, though I still couldn't explain why. They weren't doing anything wrong, weren't threatening me in any way, were just driving alongside me on a public highway where everyone has the right to be. I decided to try a more dramatic maneuver to force the situation to resolve one way or another. I put on my turn signal and moved into the left lane, deliberately crossing in front of where those lights had been hovering. I expected to see them in my passenger side mirror as I passed them, expected to finally get a look at what kind of vehicle I'd been dealing with. But as I completed my lane change and looked in the mirror, the lights were still there, still in that exact same position relative to me, now in my right-hand mirror, instead of my left-hand one, as if they'd instantly switched lanes to match my movement. Though I'd been watching and I hadn't seen them move, they'd just suddenly been in the new position, as if my hands tightened on the wheel, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the cab. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. This violated every expectation I had about how vehicles and drivers should behave on a highway. I moved back into the right lane, a more abrupt maneuver than I'd normally make, and once again the lights matched me, appearing in my left-hand mirror, in that same position they'd occupied before, as if we'd never moved at all, as if the whole lane change had been imaginary, and we were still in our original configuration. I thought about pulling over, about stopping at the shoulder, and letting whatever this was pass me, or disappear, or reveal itself to be something mundane that I'd been misunderstanding. But I was on a schedule, and pulling over on the highway shoulder at night is one of the more dangerous things a driver can do. And part of me didn't want to give this thing the satisfaction of forcing me off the road, which was a strange thought because why would I be thinking about satisfaction when I didn't even know what this was, or whether it had any kind of intention or awareness at all. The miles continued to pass, and the lights continued their vigil beside me, unwavering and constant, and I started to feel like I was losing my mind or experiencing some kind of breakdown. I turned up the volume on my radio, tried to focus on the music, tried to tell myself that there was a rational explanation for all of this, that maybe my mirrors were playing tricks on me, that maybe it was just coincidence that another driver was maintaining the same speed and position for this long. But I knew none of those explanations held water, knew deep down that what was happening was genuinely strange and potentially impossible according to the normal laws of how reality works. Then, after maybe 45 minutes of this surreal experience, the lights vanished. Not gradually, not by slowing down or speeding up or moving to a different lane. They just ceased to exist between one heartbeat and the next, my mirror showing only empty highway and darkness where the headlights had been. I actually gasped out loud, the sudden absence feeling almost as shocking as the prolonged presence had been. I checked all my mirrors multiple times, looked over both shoulders, even briefly took my eyes completely off the road ahead to scan the entire surrounding area, but the lights were simply gone, vanished as completely as if they'd never existed in the first place. For the rest of that night's drive, I kept checking my mirrors obsessively, kept waiting for those lights to reappear in some impossible location, kept half expecting to see them suddenly materialize right beside me again. But the highways stayed normal, other vehicles appearing and disappearing in the expected patterns, passing me or being passed by me, their behavior making sense according to the physics of motion and the conventions of road travel. I made it to New Orleans without any further incidents, delivered my load on time, and spent the layover period trying to convince myself that there was some reasonable explanation for what I'd experienced. I've driven that same route maybe 20 times since then, always slightly nervous when night falls, always watching my mirrors more carefully than I used to, always wondering if those lights might appear again. They haven't, at least not yet, and I've started to think that maybe it was a one-time thing, an anomaly, a glitch in whatever system governs the relationship between drivers and roads, and darkness. Or maybe it's always there, always lurking just outside the normal range of perception, and I only noticed it that one time because conditions were exactly right for it to become visible to me. They call me Outlaw Owen, and I follow every rule and regulation, and I've got a story about something that followed me for miles, on a dark highway in Louisiana. Something that shouldn't have been able to do what it did. Something that maybe wasn't a vehicle at all, but something else wearing the appearance of headlights. I don't tell this story to many people because it sounds like the kind of thing someone makes up to sound interesting or to get attention, and also because talking about it brings back that feeling of unease, that sense of being watched and paced by something that exists just slightly outside the boundaries of normal reality. But it happened, I know it happened. And somewhere out there on those dark highways, I think it might still be driving, might still be matching speed with unsuspecting drivers, holding its position in the darkness beside them, a shadow that drives and watches and never, ever passes. Story 5. The night I saw my own truck ahead of me. From Iron Ike. They call me Iron Ike, a name I earned not from any particular toughness or resilience, but from a stint early in my career, hauling iron ore and steel products across the industrial heartland, the Rust Belt territories where factories still operate and foundries still pour molten metal into molds that will become the bones of buildings and bridges. The name stuck even after I moved on to hauling other kinds of freight, diversifying into whatever paid well and kept me moving, kept the wheels turning and the bills paid and my truck maintained to the exacting standards I've always held myself to. I've been driving for 28 years now, since I was 22 years old and fresh out of a failed attempt at college, since I decided that classroom learning wasn't for me, but that the education available on America's highways might be exactly what I needed. I've logged more than 3 million miles in that time, crossed every state multiple times, seen the country from the perspective that only long-haul truckers really get to see it, the view from the cab at dawn and dusk and midnight, the endless ribbon of asphalt connecting cities and towns and isolated places that most people never even know exist. I take pride in my truck, always have, treating it not just as a tool for making money, but as a partner in this life I've chosen, something that deserves respect and care and attention to detail. My rig is a Kenworth W900, classic long nose, painted a deep metallic blue that looks almost black in certain light, but catches the sun like water when conditions are right. I keep it clean and well maintained, washing it regularly even when the weather suggests that's a futile effort, making sure the chrome gleams and the paint stays protected and every mechanical system functions exactly as it should. I know every sound my truck makes, can diagnose problems by listening to subtle changes in engine tone, or feeling minute variations in how the steering responds, or noticing the smallest differences in how the transmission shifts. My truck and I have been through a lot together, and I know it as well as I know my own body, maybe better, because I pay more attention to the truck's needs and warning signs than I sometimes pay to my own. So when I tell you that I saw my own truck ahead of me on a highway in Montana last December, you have to understand that I'm not mistaken about the identification, not confused about what I was seeing, not suffering from fatigue or hallucination, or some trick of light and shadow that made me think I recognized something that was actually unfamiliar. I know my truck, and what I saw that night was my truck. Every detail, exactly right, impossible as that should have been given that I was currently driving my truck, and it therefore couldn't possibly be anywhere else but right here with me in it. It was the week before Christmas, and I was running a load of consumer electronics from Seattle down to Denver, taking the long way through Montana instead of the more direct route through Idaho, because the weather reports suggested mountain passes farther south were getting hit with a winter storm that would make travel dangerous or impossible. The Montana route added almost a full day to my journey, but it was better to arrive late than not arrive at all. Better to take the slower, safer path than risk getting stuck in a mountain pass while a blizzard buries everything under snow measured in feet rather than inches. The first part of the drive through Montana had been beautiful in that stark winter way, the landscape all white and gray and the deep green of pine forests. The kind of scenery that makes you understand why people write poems about winter, even though winter is mostly just cold and difficult, and hard on both humans and machinery. I'd been on the road for about 6 hours, having started my day in Missoula and making my way east on Interstate 90, heading toward Billings, where I planned to stop for the night at a truck stop I'd used many times before. A place where I knew the food was decent and the parking was secure, and the showers were clean enough to actually feel cleaner after using them. The sun had set hours earlier, winter sunset coming ridiculously early at that latitude and time of year, and the night was clear and cold, temperature somewhere around 10 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that I could feel it seeping into the cab despite the heater running full blast, cold enough that I knew my fuel would be starting to gel if I hadn't already treated it with anti-gel additives. Traffic was sparse. just the occasional vehicle passing in the other direction, their headlights briefly illuminating the falling snow that had started some time in the last hour. Not heavy enough to be concerning, but enough to require attention. Enough to make the road slightly less predictable, and the white lines occasionally difficult to distinguish from the white snow accumulating along the shoulders. I was maintaining a conservative speed, maybe 5 miles under the posted limit, taking no chances, given the conditions, and the value of the cargo I was carrying, and my general philosophy, that arriving slowly is infinitely preferable to not arriving at all. That's when I first saw the tail lights ahead of me, red lights in the distance gradually growing larger as I approached, indicating another vehicle traveling in the same direction, at a slightly slower speed than I was maintaining. This was completely normal, exactly the kind of thing that happens dozens of times during any long-haul journey, and my automatic response was to start preparing to pass, checking my mirrors to make sure the left lane was clear, gauging the distance and the relative speeds and calculating whether I had enough visibility and road space to complete the maneuver safely. But, as I got closer, something about those taillights started to look familiar, in a way that made my stomach tighten and my hands grip the steering wheel a little harder. The configuration of the lights was identical to my own truck's configuration. The same spacing between the lights, the same height off the ground, the same slight asymmetry caused by a barely noticeable mounting difference that I'd never bothered to correct because it didn't affect function and was invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. As I closed the distance further, details began to emerge from the darkness and the falling snow. Details that should have been impossible. The trailer was the same kind I was pulling, a 53-foot dry van, with the same reflective tape pattern along the sides and rear, the same arrangement of marker lights and clearance lights that all trucks of this type have but that somehow looked exactly like mine, down to the specific pattern of wear on the mud flaps and the particular way one of the reflective strips on the passenger side had been damaged and imperfectly repaired. I felt my heart rate increase, felt that cold electric sensation running down my spine that comes when the brain encounters something that violates its fundamental understanding of how reality is supposed to work. I eased off the accelerator, letting my truck slow down, creating more distance between me and this impossible vehicle ahead of me, because part of me didn't want to get closer, didn't want to confirm what I was increasingly certain I was seeing. But the truck ahead maintained its speed, and after a few seconds I found myself accelerating again, unable to resist the pull of curiosity and the need to know whether what I was seeing was real or some elaborate trick my tired mind was playing on me. As I pulled into the left lane and began to pass, more details became visible, each one more impossible than the last. The truck ahead was definitely a Kenworth W900, the same model as mine, and as my headlights illuminated its side, I could see it was painted the same deep metallic blue, the same color that I'd specifically chosen years ago because it reminded me of deep water and twilight skies. I could see the same chrome stacks, the same style of fuel tanks, the same configuration of toolboxes mounted on the frame. I could even see, as I pulled alongside, the same small dent in the driver's side door that I'd gotten 2 years ago when a ladder had fallen over in a wind gust while I was parked at a delivery site, a dent I'd been meaning to fix but had never gotten around to dealing with. The shock of recognition was so complete and so overwhelming that I did something dangerous. I took my eyes off the road ahead and stared at the truck I was passing, looking directly at the driver's side window to see who was behind the wheel of this impossible duplicate of my vehicle. The window was dark, tinted, or simply unlit from within, and I couldn't make out any details of the cab's interior or the person who must be driving it. I honked my horn, a long blast that shattered the winter silence, hoping to get the other driver's attention, hoping to see them react, or look over, or give some sign that they were aware of my presence. But nothing happened. The truck ahead maintained its speed and trajectory. The dark window revealed nothing, and after a few seconds I had to return my attention to the road ahead, because I was drifting slightly toward the shoulder and the snow was making the pavement treacherous. I completed my pass and pulled back into the right lane, ahead of the truck that shouldn't exist, and I kept watching it in my mirrors. watching those familiar headlights fall back to a following distance, watching the shape and configuration that I knew as well as I knew anything in this world. My mind was racing, trying to find explanations, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was just another truck of the same make and model and color, and the specific details I thought I recognized were just common features or coincidental damage. Maybe the late hour and the falling snow and the isolation of this stretch of highway were combining to make me see patterns and similarities that weren't really there. Maybe I was more tired than I realized, and my perception was being distorted by fatigue in ways that made the unfamiliar seem familiar. But even as I tried to convince myself of these explanations, I knew they didn't hold up to scrutiny. The odds of another truck matching mine so exactly, down to the specific dent and the asymmetric light mounting and the pattern of wear on components that should be unique to my vehicle's history of use, were astronomical. So unlikely as to be essentially impossible, and I wasn't that tired, wasn't hallucinating, wasn't suffering from any kind of impairment that would cause me to misidentify something this significant. What I was seeing was my truck, my exact truck, being driven by someone else on a highway in Montana, while I was simultaneously driving that same truck from inside its cab. I maintained my speed, watching the duplicate truck in my mirrors, and it maintained its following distance, staying maybe a quarter-mile back, its headlights steady and unchanging in the winter darkness. Miles passed, 10 of them, then 15, then 20, and the impossible truck just kept following me, keeping pace, never gaining or losing ground. A constant presence in my mirrors that shouldn't exist. I thought about pulling over, about stopping to force a confrontation, or at least to see what the other truck would do, whether it would stop as well, or drive past me, whether it would maintain its impossible existence, or dissolve into something explainable once we were stationary. But something deep and instinctive warned me against stopping, told me that finding out more might be worse than living with the uncertainty, that some mysteries are better left unexamined. The fuel gauge was getting low. Not critically so, but enough that I'd been planning to stop at the next available fuel station. And when I saw the signs for a truck stop at the next exit, I made the decision to pull off, partly because I needed fuel, and partly because I wanted to see what would happen. Whether the duplicate truck would follow me off the interstate, or continue on its own trajectory. I signaled my intention well in advance, slowed as I approached the exit ramp, and took the curve that led down to the truck stop's access road, my eyes constantly checking the mirrors to see if the other truck was making the same movements. It was. The headlights in my mirrors signaled and slowed and followed me down the exit ramp, maintaining that same distance, matching my speed and path exactly as if we were connected by some invisible tether. The truck stop came into view, a bright oasis of light in the winter darkness, and I pulled into the fuel island area, positioning my truck at one of the diesel pumps and shutting down the engine. The sudden silence was profound after so many hours of constant engine noise, and I sat there for a moment, watching the mirrors, waiting to see if the duplicate truck would pull in behind me, or appear somewhere else in the lot, or simply vanish now that we'd left the highway. For several long seconds, nothing happened. The truck stop was quiet, only a couple of other vehicles visible in the parking area, the building's lights reflecting off the falling snow and creating shifting patterns of brightness and shadow. Then, at the far edge of the lot, headlights appeared, moving slowly, and I recognized immediately the configuration and spacing that I'd been watching for the last 30 miles. The duplicate truck was there, circling around through the parking area, and for a moment it seemed like it was heading directly toward me, like whoever was driving it intended to park right next to me and force some kind of confrontation or revelation. But then the truck turned away, heading not toward the parking spaces or the building, but back toward the exit that led to the highway. It picked up speed as it approached the access road, those familiar taillights growing brighter as the driver touched the brakes while navigating the turn, and then it was gone, back onto the interstate, disappearing into the winter night and the falling snow as if it had never existed at all. I sat in my cab, breathing hard, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, even though the engine was off and there was nowhere to steer. and I tried to process what I'd just experienced. I filled my fuel tank mechanically, going through the motions of pumping diesel and swiping my card and replacing the nozzle without really thinking about what I was doing, my mind still occupied with the impossibility of what I'd witnessed. When I was done, I walked around my truck, checking every detail, running my hands over the blue paint and the chrome and the dent in the driver's door, confirming that this was my truck, that I hadn't somehow gotten confused and switched vehicles without noticing, that the truck I'd been driving was the truck I'd always been driving. Everything checked out. Everything was exactly as it should be, which somehow made the experience more unsettling rather than less, because it meant there was no simple explanation, no case of mistaken identity, no rational way to dismiss what I'd seen. I went inside the truck stop and bought coffee. I didn't drink and sat in a booth by the window, staring out at the parking lot and the highway beyond, half expecting to see that duplicate truck drive past again, but the night remained empty of anything but normal traffic. Other drivers going about their business, the world continuing to operate according to its usual rules and patterns. Eventually I went back to my truck and climbed into the sleeper berth and tried to sleep, but sleep was difficult to achieve. My mind kept replaying those moments of recognition, keep asking questions that had no answers. I completed my delivery to Denver without further incident, and in the years since that night, I've driven that same stretch of Montana highway dozens of times, always watching the road ahead and behind with perhaps more attention than strictly necessary, always wondering if I might see my truck again, duplicated and impossible, driven by someone or something I can't identify. It hasn't happened again, at least not yet, and I've started to think of it as a singular experience, an anomaly that occurred once and might never occur again. But I remember every detail, remember the shock of recognition and the impossible certainty that what I was seeing was my own vehicle being driven by someone else while I simultaneously occupied it. They call me Iron Ike, and I take pride in my truck and my reputation for reliability and my careful attention to detail. And I've got a story about the night I saw myself ahead of me on a highway in Montana, about the night reality bent in a way that shouldn't be possible, about the night I learned that even the most solid and familiar things, like the vehicle you drive every day and know better than anything else, can become strange and uncertain when the conditions are right and the world decides to show you something that exists outside the normal boundaries of what should be possible. I don't know what it meant, don't know if it was some kind of warning or premonition or just a random glitch in whatever system governs the relationship between drivers and their vehicles and the roads that connect everywhere to everywhere else. But I saw it, and I remember it, and I carry it with me. One more mystery filed away in the collection of strange things that happen out here on the roads where reality sometimes becomes flexible and the impossible becomes briefly, undeniably real. Story 6. The Highway with Footsteps on the Roof. From Mudflap Marty. They call me Mudflap Marty, a name that came from my early days driving when I was known for hitting every puddle and mud pit between here and there, coming back from runs looking like I'd driven through a swamp instead of on maintained highways. My truck so covered in mud and road spray that you could barely read the company name on the doors. I've cleaned up my act since then, learned to avoid the worst of the weather and the roughest roads when possible. But the name stuck, and now it's just who I am in the community of drivers who share these roads and these stories. I've been hauling freight for 35 years now. Started when I was barely old enough to get my commercial license. Started because my father had been a driver, and his father before him. A family tradition of long-haul trucking that goes back to when the interstate system was still being built, and trucks were simpler machines without all the computers and sensors and electronic systems that make modern rigs both more efficient and more complicated. I run mostly the northeastern corridor, up and down the coast from Maine to Maryland, sometimes venturing inland to Pittsburgh or Buffalo or Albany, carrying everything from seafood packed in ice to furniture to construction materials, whatever needs moving and whatever pays enough to make the trip worthwhile. I know these roads intimately, know which rest stops have the best coffee, and which way stations are most likely to pull you in for inspection, and which stretches of highway are prone to fog or ice, or sudden traffic jams that can turn a routine drive into an hours-long ordeal. I've driven through every kind of weather this part of the country can produce, from summer heat waves that make the pavement soft and sticky to winter blizzards that reduce visibility to nothing, and make you wonder why anyone ever thought it was a good idea to try to move goods during the months when nature is actively hostile to travel. But nothing in all those years of experience, nothing in all those miles and all those different weather conditions, and all those strange encounters with difficult roads and difficult drivers, prepared me for what happened on a late September night on a stretch of Route 81 in Pennsylvania, somewhere between Scranton and Binghamton, somewhere in that empty corridor where the highway cuts through forested mountains and small towns that seem to exist primarily to service travelers rather than having any independent reason for being. It was around 2 in the morning, that dead hour when even the most dedicated drivers are fighting fatigue and the world feels reduced to just the small bubble of light created by your headlights, everything beyond that circle of visibility becoming abstract and theoretical rather than real and present. I was hauling a load of restaurant equipment from Connecticut up to Syracuse, running behind schedule because of an accident that had closed the highway for 3 hours earlier in the evening, sitting in stopped traffic while emergency crews cleared wreckage and tended to injured people. The kind of delay that's frustrating, but that also reminds you how quickly things can go wrong out here. How the difference between a routine trip and a tragedy can be a moment of inattention or a mechanical failure, or just bad luck putting you in the wrong place at the wrong time. Once traffic started moving again, I'd been pushing a little harder than I normally would, trying to make up some of the lost time, though still staying within the legal limits and still being careful because no schedule is worth risking safety. The highway was nearly empty. Just me and the occasional vehicle passing in the other direction. Their headlights briefly visible in the distance before they flashed past and disappeared into the darkness behind me. The woods pressed close on both sides of the road. Pine and oak and maple trees that during daylight would be starting their autumn color transformation, but that at night were just black masses blocking out the stars. There was no moon, or if there was, it was hidden behind cloud cover, making the darkness absolute beyond the reach of my headlights. The kind of darkness that feels almost solid, almost like a physical thing you're pushing through, rather than just the absence of light. I had my CB on, but turned down low. Just occasional bursts of static, and the rare transmission from some other driver, somewhere on the same frequency. Nothing interesting enough to really pay attention to. Just background noise that provided a reminder that I wasn't completely alone, even though it felt like I was the only person awake in the entire state. My coffee from the last truck stop had gone cold in its cup, but I sipped it anyway. More for the ritual of it than for any real caffeine benefit at this point. The heater was running because the September night was cooler than the day had been, and I was comfortable in that particular way that long-distance drivers know, that state of relaxed alertness where your body is handling the mechanical tasks of driving almost automatically while your mind wanders through thoughts and memories and observations about the landscape rolling past. That's when I heard the first footstep on the roof of my cab. It was unmistakable, a heavy thump directly above my head. The sound of weight striking metal with force, accompanied by a slight vibration I could feel through the seat and steering wheel. My first instinct was to look up, as if I could somehow see through the solid metal roof to identify what had made the sound. But of course, that was impossible. My second instinct was to try to rationalize it, to find some explanation that made sense within the normal boundaries of how the world works. Maybe I'd driven under a low branch, and it had scraped or struck the top of the cab. Maybe something had fallen off an overpass I'd just passed under. Maybe it was some kind of mechanical issue with the truck, something coming loose or breaking in a way that produced that particular sound. But even as I was running through these possibilities, I knew they didn't quite fit what I'd heard. The sound had been too discreet, too much like a footstep, with that characteristic pattern of impact and brief pressure and release that comes from a foot striking a surface. And before I could fully process the first sound or settle on an explanation, I heard it again, another heavy footstep. This one slightly forward, and to the right of the first, as if whatever was up there was walking across my roof. moving from the rear of the cab toward the front. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I found myself holding my breath, listening intently, every sense focused on trying to understand what was happening above me. Another footstep came, and then another, a steady walking pace. The sound of something or someone moving across the roof of my cab with deliberate steps. Not hurried or frantic, but purposeful, as if whoever or whatever it was had a destination in mind and was calmly walking toward it. The sounds were accompanied by slight vibrations, the weight of each step being transmitted through the metal structure of the cab, and I could feel them, not just hear them, could sense through the frame of the truck that something heavy was moving around up there. My rational mind was screaming that this was impossible, that there was no way anything could be on the roof of my truck while I was driving at highway speed, that the wind resistance alone would make it impossible for anything to maintain its position up there, let alone walk around in a casual manner, as if completely unaffected by the rushing air that must be battering anything exposed on the exterior of a vehicle moving at 60 miles per hour. But my senses were telling me something different, were telling me with absolute certainty that something was up there, something with weight and solidity and intention, something that was currently walking around on the roof of my cab while I drove through the Pennsylvania darkness. The footsteps continued, moving from the rear of the cab toward the front, then pausing for a moment directly above my head, centered on the roof, as if whatever was up there had stopped to look down, to contemplate the driver below, who was increasingly terrified by sounds he couldn't explain and couldn't make stop. Then the footsteps resumed, moving forward toward the front edge of the cab, and I had a sudden horrifying vision of whatever was up there climbing down onto the hood, appearing in front of my windshield, looking at me with eyes that might not be human, eyes that might belong to something that had no business existing in the world of highways and trucks and normal human experience. I slowed down, easing off the accelerator, not sure what I planned to do, but feeling like maintaining speed was somehow making me complicit in whatever was happening. Like by continuing to drive normally I was accepting this situation as normal, when it was anything but. The footsteps paused when my speed decreased, as if whoever or whatever was up there was aware of the change in velocity and was adjusting its own movements in response. Then they resumed, but now they were moving back toward the rear of the cab, retracing their earlier path, moving away from the front edge, where I'd feared they were heading. I checked my mirrors reflexively, looking at the road behind me and beside me, making sure I wasn't about to be overtaken by some other vehicle that might have a better vantage point to see what was on top of my cab. But the highway remained empty, just my truck and the darkness and whatever impossible thing was walking on my roof. The footsteps reached the rear edge of the cab and then seemed to continue onto the trailer, the sounds becoming slightly more distant, slightly less immediate, though still perfectly audible, and still accompanied by vibrations I could feel through the frame. Now whatever it was walking along the top of my trailer, moving steadily toward the back, each step deliberate and measured, covering the length of that 53-foot box, in a walk that should have taken minutes but seemed to happen in seconds, time becoming strange and uncertain as terror does things to perception. Then, as suddenly as they'd started, the footsteps stopped. The last one came from somewhere near the rear of the trailer, and then there was nothing, just the normal sounds of my truck and the road and the wind rushing past. I waited, barely breathing, listening for any indication that the sounds might resume, that whatever had been walking up there might return. But seconds passed into minutes, and the silence remained unbroken, and gradually I became aware that I'd slowed to maybe 40 miles per hour, well below the posted limit, and that I needed to either pull over completely or resume normal speed before some other driver came up behind me and rear-ended me because they didn't expect to find someone going so slow on a highway at night. I accelerated back to normal speed, my hands still shaking on the wheel, my heart still racing, adrenaline flooding my system in quantities that made me feel jittery and hyper-alert and slightly nauseous. I drove for maybe another 10 miles before I saw signs for a rest area, and I took the exit without hesitation, needing to stop, needing to get out and look at the roof of my truck. needing to find some evidence that would either confirm what I'd experienced or provide an alternative explanation that would let me sleep tonight without nightmares about impossible footsteps. The rest area was small and empty, just a parking lot and a small building with bathrooms, no other vehicles in sight. I pulled into a parking space, shut down the engine, and sat there for a moment in the sudden silence, gathering my courage to get out and look. Finally, I opened the door and climbed down, my legs unsteady, and I walked around to where I could see the cab's roof. It was too high to examine closely without climbing up, but even from ground level I could see that there was nothing obvious. No damage, no marks, no indication that anything had been up there at all. I got my flashlight from the cab and found the ladder rungs that allow you to climb up the side of the truck for maintenance access, and I climbed carefully until I could see the roof clearly, shining the flashlight across the painted metal surface. Nothing. No footprints, no scuff marks, no dents or scratches, or any kind of physical evidence that something with weight had walked across it. The roof was dusty and slightly dirty from road grime, but the dust wasn't disturbed, wasn't marked with any kind of pattern that would indicate footsteps or movement. I checked the trailer top as well, climbing up to examine it, and found the same thing, just normal wear and dirt, no signs of anything unusual. I climbed back down and stood in the empty parking lot, staring at my truck, trying to reconcile what I'd heard and felt with what I was seeing, which was exactly nothing. No evidence, no proof, no physical confirmation that the experience had been real. Part of me was relieved that there was nothing visible, because visible evidence would have meant accepting that something impossible had happened, that something that shouldn't exist had been walking on my truck. But part of me was frustrated, because the absence of evidence didn't make the experience less real, didn't change the fact that I'd heard those footsteps and felt those vibrations, and now I was left with a memory I couldn't validate or explain. I got back in the cab and sat there until my hands stopped shaking and my heart rate returned to something approaching normal, and then I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway and continued my journey to Syracuse. I delivered my load on time, and I drove back south through that same stretch of Pennsylvania highway in daylight a couple of days later, and everything looked completely normal. Just trees and road and occasional exits. Nothing sinister or strange. Nothing that would make you think twice about traveling through there at any hour. But I remember, and I always will remember, the sound of heavy footsteps walking across the roof of my cab at 2 in the morning on a dark highway in Pennsylvania. The feeling of weight pressing down on the metal above my head, the steady rhythm of something walking where nothing should have been able to walk. I've talked to other drivers about it, casually, not making a big deal of it, but just mentioning in passing that I'd heard something strange on my roof once, and more than one of them has gotten a particular look in their eyes, a look that suggests they've experienced something similar but don't talk about it because who would believe them, because admitting to inexplicable experiences in a profession that prides itself on reliability and rationality feels like confessing to being unstable or unfit for the road. They call me Mudflap Marty, and I've been driving these roads longer than some of the other drivers have been alive. And I've got a story about footsteps on the roof that I don't tell very often because it sounds impossible, and because I have no evidence beyond my own memory and the certainty that what I heard was real. But it happened, and somewhere out there on those dark highways, where the woods press close and the night feels thick and solid, I think it might be happening still. Might be happening to other drivers who hear sounds above them that shouldn't be there, who feel weight moving across their roofs in patterns that match footsteps, who drive through the darkness wondering what walks above them in places where nothing should be walking at all. Story 7. The Gas Station That Moves. From Diesel Dan. They call me Diesel Dan, a straightforward name that came from my preference for diesel engines over gasoline, from my belief that diesel power is more reliable and more economical for the kind of long-haul work I do. From the simple fact that every truck I've ever owned or operated has run on diesel fuel, and I've developed something of a reputation for knowing diesel mechanics and being able to diagnose engine problems by sound alone. I've been on the road for 26 years, running routes primarily through the Southwest, that vast expanse of desert and canyon country, where distances between civilization can be measured in hours rather than miles, where the landscape is beautiful in a harsh and unforgiving way, where you learn to respect the power of nature and the vulnerability of machines when you're crossing spaces that don't care whether you make it across or not. I haul everything from consumer goods to construction equipment to agricultural products, following the work wherever it takes me, sometimes running the same routes repeatedly for weeks or months when a particular contract keeps me busy, sometimes ranging far afield when opportunities arise in unexpected places. I've driven through Death Valley in summer, when the temperature reaches numbers that seem impossible for anything to survive, through Nevada thunderstorms that turn dry washes into raging torrents in minutes, across New Mexico plains where the wind blows so hard and so constantly that you have to fight the steering wheel to maintain your lane, through Arizona sunsets that paint the desert in colors so vivid they seem artificial, like someone has enhanced the saturation beyond what nature should be capable of producing. Through all of this, through all these miles and all these landscapes, I've learned the importance of knowing where fuel stations are located, where you can reliably find diesel and water and basic supplies when you need them. In the Southwest, gas stations can be few and far between, isolated outposts of civilization separated by vast distances of nothing, and running out of fuel in the wrong location can mean hours of waiting for assistance, significant expense, and the kind of delays that upset customers and damage your reputation. So I pay attention to where stations are, make note of their locations, plan my routes with fuel stops in mind, maintaining a mental map of reliable places where I can fill up and keep moving, which is why what happened last summer, running a load from Phoenix up to Salt Lake City, was so profoundly disorienting and ultimately inexplicable. I'd been running this particular route 3 or 4 times a month for the better part of a year, hauling manufactured goods northward and bringing back agricultural products or raw materials for processing. A regular circuit that had become familiar to the point of being almost routine. I knew every major landmark along the way, knew where the good truck stops were, knew the approximate distances between fuel opportunities, knew the rhythm of this journey as well as I knew anything. There was a particular gas station I always used, a small independent place just off US 93 in Nevada, maybe an hour south of the Utah border. One of those classic desert outpost operations that seems to exist in defiance of economics and probability, serving a small enough customer base that you wonder how they stay in business, but somehow managing to persist year after year. The station was nothing fancy, just a few pumps under a metal canopy, a small convenience store with dusty shelves, stocked with basic necessities, and usually one attendant who looked perpetually bored by the emptiness of the surrounding landscape. But the diesel was reasonably priced, the facilities were clean enough, and the location was perfect for my fuel planning, falling at exactly the right point in the journey where my tank would be approaching half empty, and I'd want to top off before continuing north into Utah. I'd stopped at this station maybe 40 times over the preceding year, always finding it in the same place, always experiencing the same basic interaction, fuel, and perhaps a coffee or snack from the store. A few words exchanged with the attendant about weather or road conditions, then back on the highway to continue north. The station was predictable and reliable, exactly what you want from a fuel stop, no surprises or complications, just a transaction completed efficiently so you can get back to the business of covering distance. But on this particular trip, in mid-July, with the desert heat making the air shimmer and distorting distances, when I reached the point where that gas station should have been, it wasn't there. The exit was there, the off-ramp leading down from the highway to a service road that ran parallel to the interstate. But where the gas station should have been visible just a quarter mile down that service road, there was nothing. Just empty desert, scattered creosote bushes and Joshua trees, bare dirt and rock extending to distant mountains that wavered in the heat haze. I actually rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe the glare and the heat were playing tricks on my vision, creating some kind of mirage or optical illusion that made the station invisible when it was actually right there where it should be. But no matter how I looked, or from what angle, there was simply nothing at that location. I checked my mile markers, made sure I hadn't somehow gotten confused about which exit I needed, but everything confirmed I was in the right place. This was definitely the correct exit, and the gas station that had been there 40 times before had simply vanished. My fuel situation wasn't critical yet. I still had maybe a quarter tank, but I'd been planning on filling up here, and the next reliable station was another hour north. Maybe more, and I started doing mental calculations about whether I had enough fuel to make it there safely, or whether I should take a different route, or adjust my plans somehow. But more than the practical concern about fuel, I was bothered by the impossibility of what I was seeing, the fundamental wrongness of a permanent structure like a gas station, just not being there when it should be, when it had been there so recently, when there was no reason for it to have disappeared. I continued north, deciding to deal with the fuel question at the next station, and hoping that maybe I'd just made some kind of mistake about the location, though I couldn't imagine what that mistake might have been. The next hour passed uneventfully, just highway and desert, and the steady consumption of diesel fuel from my tank as the gauge crept lower and lower. When I reached the next town and found a fuel station, I pulled in and filled up. And while the pump was running, I asked the attendant if he knew anything about the small station south of here, whether it had closed recently or moved or experienced some problem. The attendant looked at me with a blank expression and said he didn't know of any station in that area, that between his location and the state border to the south there weren't any fuel services he was aware of, which directly contradicted my experience of having stopped at exactly such a station many times before. I described the location more precisely, mentioned specific features of the landscape and the exit number, but he just shook his head and said I must be thinking of somewhere else, because there definitely wasn't a gas station where I was describing. I completed my delivery to Salt Lake City and tried to put the whole thing out of my mind, chalking it up to some kind of confusion or misremembering on my part, though the explanation didn't feel right. Didn't account for the clarity of my memory or the number of times I'd used that station. When I ran the return trip south a few days later, I paid careful attention as I approached that area, determined to solve this mystery one way or another. And this time, impossibly, the gas station was there, exactly where it should be, exactly as I remembered it. The familiar metal canopy and dusty storefront and weathered signs advertising diesel fuel and cold drinks. I pulled off the highway and drove down the service road and pulled up to the pumps, feeling a strange mix of relief and confusion, glad that I hadn't been completely crazy or mistaken, but disturbed by the fact that the station had definitely not been there a few days earlier when I'd looked for it. I filled my tank and went inside to pay, and the attendant was the same older man I'd seen many times before, friendly in a reserved way, asking how my trip had been and commenting on the heat. I wanted to ask him where the station had been a few days ago, why it hadn't been here when I'd looked for it, but the question seemed insane, seemed like the kind of thing that would mark me as someone who was losing touch with reality, so I just paid and left, driving back to the highway with more questions than answers. Over the next several months, I ran that route maybe a dozen more times, and the gas station was there about half the time and absent the other half, with no pattern I could discern too, when it would be present and when it would be missing. Sometimes I'd stop there on my northbound leg and it would be gone on my return trip. Sometimes it would be absent on the way north and present on the way back. There seemed to be no correlation with time of day or day of week or any other variable I could identify. The station simply appeared and disappeared according to some logic I couldn't fathom, sometimes existing and sometimes not, occupying that location in what felt like an intermittent or unstable way. I started keeping notes, documenting each time I passed that area and whether the station was present or absent, trying to find some pattern or explanation. I talked to other drivers who ran similar routes, asking in casual conversation whether they'd noticed anything strange about gas stations appearing and disappearing. But most of them just looked at me like I was speaking nonsense or making a joke they didn't understand. One driver, though, An older man named Red Hood been running Southwest routes for 40 years, got a particular look in his eyes when I mentioned it, and he said quietly that there were places out in the desert where things didn't stay put quite the way they should, where the landscape had a fluidity to it that defied normal expectations, and that if I'd found one of those places, the smart thing to do was fuel up when the opportunity presented itself, and not ask too many questions about why or how. I took his advice, and now, when I run that route, I check for the station as I approach that area. And if it's there, I stop and fuel up regardless of how much fuel I currently have, taking advantage of its presence while I can. And if it's not there, I just continue on to the next station, adjusting my fuel planning accordingly, not worrying too much about the absence, because I know it might be there next time, or it might not, existing according to rules I don't understand, and probably never will. The last time I stopped there, just a few weeks ago, I went inside after fueling up, and looked around the store more carefully than I usually did, paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked. The merchandise was all slightly out of date, packaging designs from 5 or 10 years ago, brands that I thought had been discontinued or redesigned. The calendar on the wall behind the counter showed a date from 2018. The newspaper rack held editions from various dates, none of them current, some from years past. The attendant was friendly as always, but when I looked at him closely, I noticed that he was wearing the exact same clothes I'd seen him wearing on my very first visit to this station, more than a year ago, and they looked neither newer nor more worn than they had then, as if time wasn't passing for him the way it passes for the rest of us. I paid for my fuel and left without asking any of the questions that were filling my head, because some part of me understands that this station exists in a different way than normal places exist, that it's operating according to different rules, that it appears when it wants to appear, and for reasons that might have nothing to do with serving the needs of travelers like me. Maybe it's a place that's slipping between different versions of reality, sometimes present in our world, and sometimes existing somewhere else. Maybe it's a memory of a gas station that used to be there, and that somehow occasionally becomes real enough to interact with. Maybe it's something else entirely, something that I don't have the concepts or vocabulary to describe properly. They call me Diesel Dan, and I know these Southwest routes as well as anyone. And I've got a story about a gas station that doesn't stay in one place, about a station that exists intermittently, appearing and disappearing according to logic I don't understand. Most people I tell this to just think I'm confused, or that I'm mixing up different locations, or that I need to get my memory checked. And maybe they're right. Maybe there's some simple explanation that I'm missing. But I've been keeping notes, and I've been paying attention, and I know what I've experienced, and I know that there's a place out there on US 93 in Nevada where reality doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to, where a gas station flickers in and out of existence like a light on a faulty circuit, sometimes there and sometimes not, serving customers from multiple versions of reality, or multiple points in time, or multiple possibilities of what could be, and I use it when it's available. Fill up my tank and buy a cold drink and exchange a few words with an attendant who might not experience time the same way I do, and then I get back on the highway and continue my journey, carrying one more impossible story in the collection of strange things that happen out here, where the desert stretches vast and empty, and the normal rules sometimes don't apply. Story 8. The Fog That Hums. From Silent Sam. They call me Silent Sam, a name that's caused some confusion over the years, since there's apparently another driver who goes by a similar handle. But I got mine from my tendency to keep my CB radio off more often than on, preferring the quiet of my own thoughts to the constant chatter that fills the airwaves on most major routes. I've been driving for 21 years now, started relatively late compared to some drivers. Didn't get behind the wheel of a commercial vehicle until I was in my early 30s and looking for a career change after spending a decade in an office job that was slowly suffocating my soul with its fluorescent lights and cubicle walls and endless meetings about things that didn't matter. The road offered escape, offered solitude, offered the chance to be alone with the landscape and my thoughts, and I took to it immediately. discovering that I was good at the driving part but even better at the mental discipline required to spend long hours alone without becoming restless or anxious or desperate for human interaction. I run routes primarily through the upper Midwest, Minnesota and Wisconsin, and Michigan, occasionally venturing into the Dakotas or down into Iowa and Illinois, carrying freight that's as varied as the landscape. Everything from dairy products to automotive parts, to lumber, to the million small manufactured items that keep the economy functioning. I've driven through every season these northern states can produce. From summer heat that makes the cornfields shimmer and the asphalt soft, through autumn colors that turn the hardwood forests into something that belongs on a postcard, through winters so brutal that even thinking about being outside makes you cold, through springs where the world seems to explode with green life and flowing water after months of frozen dormancy. The weather up here is serious business, not just an inconvenience, but a genuine threat, if you don't just an inconvenience, but a genuine threat, if you don't respect it, and if you don't think it is, and maintained in scent, and made it to next in, and what they mot it, to med it så det tek to out to bin it But for all the challenging weather I've encountered, all the blizzards and ice storms and summer thunderstorms that turn highways into rivers, nothing has been quite as unsettling as what happened one October evening on a rural highway in northern Wisconsin. Somewhere between nowhere and nowhere else, on a road that barely qualified as a highway, but that GPS had determined was the most efficient route for reaching my destination given current traffic patterns and construction delays on more major arteries. It was that particular time in autumn when the days are noticeably shorter and the nights carry a genuine chill, when the leaves are past their peak color and starting to fall in earnest, carpeting the roadways with slick layers of organic matter that can be as treacherous as ice when they're wet. I'd been driving since dawn, and by the time evening arrived, I was tired, but not dangerously so. Still well within my legal hours, and still alert enough to handle whatever the road might present. The highway I was following was 2 lanes, winding through dense forest that pressed close on both sides. The kind of road where deer are a constant concern, and where you maintain a careful watch on the shoulders for any sign of movement that might indicate an animal about to leap into your path. Traffic was nearly non-existent, just the occasional vehicle passing in the other direction, headlights briefly visible through the trees before flashing past and disappearing. The sun had set maybe half an hour earlier, and the twilight was fading into full darkness, that transition period when visibility is at its worst, because your eyes haven't fully adjusted to night vision, but there's not enough ambient light to see clearly. That's when the fog appeared. Not gradually as fog usually does, not building up slowly from low-lying areas, or creeping in from water sources, but suddenly and completely. One moment the road was clear, and the next moment I was driving through fog so thick I could barely see 20 feet ahead of my truck. It was the kind of fog that seems almost solid, that diffuses headlight beams into useless glowing spheres that illuminate nothing but the fog itself, that turns the world into a white void where distance and dimension become impossible to judge. I immediately slowed down, dropping from highway speed to maybe 30 miles per hour, my hands tight on the wheel, my attention focused completely on trying to distinguish the road from the fog, trying to keep my truck between the barely visible lines that marked the pavement's edges. But what made this fog different, what made it more than just another weather challenge to be carefully navigated, was the sound it made. The fog was humming, producing a low-frequency sound that I could feel as much as hear, a vibration that seemed to resonate in my chest and in the frame of the truck itself. It wasn't a mechanical sound, wasn't the kind of noise that engines or electrical systems make. It was organic somehow, almost musical, a sustained tone that fluctuated slightly in pitch and volume, but never stopped, never paused, just continued its strange song as I drove deeper into the white emptiness. At first I thought maybe I was imagining it, that the stress of driving in near-zero visibility was making me perceive sounds that weren't really there. Auditory hallucinations born from exhaustion and tension. But the sound was too consistent, too real, too physical in the way it made the air around me vibrate. I could feel it through the steering wheel, could feel it in the seat beneath me, could feel it in my teeth as the vibration resonated through my skull. This was not imagination. This was something real, something present in or produced by the fog itself. And the realization sent cold fingers of fear down my spine, despite my usual calm demeanor. I considered stopping, pulling over to the shoulder and waiting for the fog to clear. But visibility was so poor that I worried about being rear-ended by any vehicle that might come up behind me, and the narrow shoulder offered little room for a truck my size. And something instinctive told me that stopping in this particular fog would be a mistake. That movement was safer than stillness, even though movement felt dangerous. So I continued forward at a crawl, maybe 20 miles per hour now, my eyes straining to pick out any detail from the white void, my ears full of that strange humming that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The fog grew thicker, if such a thing was possible, and the humming grew louder, the vibration more intense, until I felt like I was driving through something that was more than just water vapor, suspended in air. Something that had substance and presence and perhaps even awareness. The headlights were worse than useless now, reflecting off the fog and actually making visibility worse. So I turned them off and relied just on my parking lights, which at least didn't create as much glare. In the dimmer light, the fog took on a slightly luminescent quality, as if it was generating its own faint glow, and I could see movement within it, swirls and eddies that seemed too deliberate to be just random air currents, patterns that looked almost intentional. The humming changed pitch, dropping lower, and I felt the vibration increase until my entire truck was shaking slightly, a tremor that ran through the frame and made the steering wheel buzz under my hands. The sound was no longer just one tone, but multiple tones layered over each other, creating harmonics and resonances that were beautiful in a deeply unsettling way, like music composed by something that understood sound, but not human preferences, not human emotional responses to particular combinations of frequencies. I found myself holding my breath without meaning to, listening to this impossible chorus, trying to determine if there was meaning in it, if the patterns of tone and rhythm were communicating something I should be trying to understand. Then, through the fog ahead of me, I saw lights. Not headlights, but something else, points of luminescence that moved independently, floating through the white void in paths that didn't correspond to where a road should be. They were roughly circular, maybe the size of basketballs, glowing with a cool blue-white light that was nothing like any vehicle illumination I'd ever seen. There were dozens of them, maybe more, moving in what looked like deliberate patterns, orbiting each other, forming temporary constellations before breaking apart and reforming in new arrangements. The humming intensified when the lights appeared, the different tones seeming to correspond to different lights, each one producing its own frequency that combined with all the others to create that complex layered sound. I slowed almost to a stop, my foot hovering over the brake pedal, watching these impossible lights move through the fog around my truck. They came close enough that I could have reached out and touched one if I'd opened my window and extended my arm. Close enough that I could see they cast no shadows despite their brightness. Close enough that I could observe that the fog swirled around them as if they had mass and were displacing air as they moved. They didn't acknowledge my presence in any obvious way, didn't change their patterns or approach my truck specifically, just continued their dance through the fog as if I wasn't there, as if my truck was simply another obstacle to flow around like a rock in a stream. I sat there in near darkness, engine idling, watching this display that seemed to belong more to a dream or hallucination than to waking reality on a Wisconsin highway. The lights moved in 3 dimensions, not just horizontally, but rising and falling through the fog layers, sometimes disappearing into the white above or below, only to emerge again elsewhere. Their movements coordinated in ways that suggested communication or shared purpose. The humming continued its complex song, and I realized I could almost distinguish patterns in it, almost hear what might be structure or language, though it was like trying to understand speech in a language composed of sounds that human vocal systems couldn't produce and that human ears weren't really designed to process. I don't know how long I sat there watching, time becoming uncertain in that white void where nothing was as it should be, and where the normal markers of reality seemed suspended. It might have been 5 minutes or 30, I genuinely couldn't say, my watch showing readings that didn't seem to match my subjective experience of duration. Eventually, the lights began to move away, drifting off into the fog in what looked like a deliberate departure, rather than a random dispersal, gathering together into a loose formation, and moving away from the road, away from my truck, ascending or moving laterally through the fog, until they were just faint glows in the distance, and then nothing at all, disappeared completely, as if they'd never existed. The humming diminished as the lights departed, the multiple tones dropping away one by one, until only that bass frequency remained, and then even that faded, growing quieter and quieter, until it merged with the normal ambient sounds of engine and road and wind, until I couldn't be certain I was still hearing it or just remembering it. The vibration in my chest could be just my own heartbeat, elevated by adrenaline and fear. The fog remained thick for another few minutes, and then it too began to dissipate, not gradually thinning, but seeming to lift all at once, rising off the road like a curtain being drawn upward, revealing the forest and highway and normal night that had been hidden beneath it. I sat there for a moment in the sudden clear air, my truck still idling on a road that now looked completely ordinary. Just another rural Wisconsin highway, cutting through pine forest under a sky full of stars. I looked around carefully, checking my mirrors, examining the surrounding landscape for any sign of the lights, or any indication that what I'd just experienced had left physical traces. But there was nothing, just normal forest, and normal pavement, and the normal sounds of a cool October night in the North Woods. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. My breathing was rapid and shallow, and I felt simultaneously exhausted and wired, drained by the experience, but too amped up on adrenaline to feel the tiredness that should have been overwhelming me. I put the truck in gear and started moving again, slowly at first, and then building back up to normal highway speed, my eyes constantly scanning the road ahead and the mirrors behind, half expecting the fog to return or the lights to reappear. But the rest of that night's drive was completely uneventful. Just normal highway conditions, and normal traffic, and normal everything. And by the time I reached my destination, the whole experience had started to feel unreal, like something I'd dreamed rather than something I'd actually witnessed. I delivered my load on schedule, and didn't mention what I'd seen to anyone at the receiving dock, because what would I say that wouldn't make me sound unhinged or unreliable? I've driven that same road many times since, always slightly nervous as I approached the area where the fog appeared, always watching carefully for any sign that it might happen again, but it never has, at least not yet. The road remains just a road, the forest remains just a forest, and the fog when it comes is just normal fog. Water vapor that reduces visibility, but doesn't hum, doesn't glow, doesn't contain lights that move with purpose and intention. I've researched the area online, looking for any historical accounts of similar phenomena, any reports of strange lights or sounds in that region, any folklore or legend that might provide context for what I experienced. I've found scattered references to lights in the forests, old stories from indigenous peoples about spirits that glow and sing, modern accounts of UFO sightings, and strange atmospheric phenomena, but nothing that quite matches what I witnessed, nothing that captures the specific combination of fog and sound and light that I encountered that October night. They call me Silent Sam, and I prefer the quiet of my own thoughts to the noise of constant conversation, and I've got a story about a fog that hummed and lights that danced through it like living things. about a night when the normal world disappeared and something else took its place for a few minutes or hours. Something that existed according to different rules and that left no trace of its presence except the memory carried by one driver who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time, or maybe the right place at the wrong time, depending on how you choose to think about such things. I don't know what I saw, don't know if it was natural phenomena that science could explain if only I could describe it precisely enough to the right experts, or if it was something else, something that exists in the margins of reality, something that occasionally becomes visible when conditions align in particular ways. But I know I saw it, know I heard it, know I felt that vibration in my chest and my bones, and I carry that memory with me every time I drive through fog now, listening carefully, watching for any hint of luminescence or any suggestion of that deep humming tone, wondering if maybe tonight will be the night when the fog that hums returns and shows me once again that the world contains more mysteries than I previously imagined possible. Story 9. The Rest Stop with My Name on Every Locker. From Big Mike. They call me Big Mike, a straightforward descriptive name that comes from the simple fact that I'm a large man, 6'4", and well over 250 pounds. Built like the linebacker. I was back in high school before I discovered that I wasn't quite good enough for college football and needed to find some other path through life. I've been driving for 18 years now, hauling freight across the southern states, Texas to Florida, to Louisiana to Arkansas, and everywhere in between, carrying loads that are as varied as my roots. Everything from manufactured goods to agricultural products to construction materials, to the occasional specialized cargo that requires specific handling and climate control. I'm known among the drivers I run into regularly as someone who's reliable and professional, someone who takes care of his equipment and delivers on time, and doesn't cause drama or problems for dispatchers or customers. I maintain my truck in nearly pristine condition, keep detailed logs that would satisfy even the most particular dot inspector, and pride myself on being exactly the kind of driver that companies want on their roster. But despite this reputation for being solid and dependable and thoroughly grounded in reality, I had an experience last spring at a rest stop in Mississippi that I still can't explain. That still makes me question whether I was dreaming or hallucinating, or whether something genuinely impossible happened to me on a warm April night, when the dogwoods were blooming and the air smelled like honeysuckle, and everything should have been perfectly normal and ordinary. I was running a load from Houston up to Memphis, a route I've driven dozens of times, familiar territory where I know all the good stopping points, and all the places to avoid, and all the approximate timing for various segments of the journey. It was late, somewhere around midnight, and I'd been driving since mid-afternoon, making good time on roads that were mostly empty, just the occasional vehicle sharing the highway with me as the rest of the world slept. I'd been planning to push through to Memphis without stopping, but as I crossed into Mississippi, I felt the need to use a restroom, becoming urgent enough that I decided to pull off at the next rest area rather than waiting until I reached my destination. The rest stop appeared right on schedule, exactly where it should be, according to my knowledge of this route, a standard Mississippi Department of Transportation facility, set back from the interstate, with the usual configuration of parking lot and bathroom building and picnic tables, scattered around under security lights that turned everything into shades of orange and deep shadow. I pulled into a parking space, shut down my engine, and climbed out of the cab, stretching my back and legs after hours of sitting, feeling the warm, humid air wrap around me after the climate-controlled interior of my truck. The rest stop was nearly empty. Just my truck and maybe 2 or 3 passenger vehicles scattered around the lot, their occupants presumably either sleeping or inside using the facilities. I walked toward the bathroom building, my boots loud on the pavement in the late-night quiet, and pushed through the heavy door into the bright fluorescent interior. The bathroom was exactly what you'd expect from a rest stop facility. Tile walls and floors, institutional fixtures, that particular smell of industrial cleaning products mixed with the underlying odors they're meant to mask. I attended to my needs quickly and efficiently, washed my hands at one of the sinks while examining my reflection in the mirror and noting that I looked as tired as I felt. the day's driving showing in the shadows under my eyes and the set of my shoulders. That's when I noticed the lockers. They were against the far wall, the kind of coin-operated storage lockers you sometimes see in transit facilities or gyms. Metal boxes in various sizes that you can rent for a few hours or a day to store belongings while you're elsewhere. I'd been in this particular rest stop maybe 20 times before, and I had no memory of these lockers being there previously. But it's also true that I don't always pay careful attention to every detail of every facility I use, focusing instead on completing my business efficiently so I can get back on the road. What caught my attention wasn't just the presence of the lockers, but the fact that many of them had names written on them, names scrawled in marker or scratched into the paint. The kind of informal labeling that might happen if regular users wanted to stake a claim to particular units. And every single name I could see, on every locker that had a name on it, was Mike. Not just Mike, but variations of it. Michael and Mikey, and Big Mike and Mike, with various last names attached. Mike J and Mike T, and Mike Rodriguez and Mike Chen. Dozens of different Mikes covering nearly every locker in the installation. I stopped in the middle of the restroom, staring at this wall of lockers, with my name repeated over and over, feeling a chill run through me despite the warm, humid air. I walked closer, examining the names more carefully, and found one that said Big Mike from Houston, which was close enough to my own identity to make my breath catch in my throat. Another said Mike 6 feet 4 inches trucker, and that was even more specific, even more directly applicable to me. Another said Mike who played linebacker, and that was information that almost nobody would know about me, ancient history from my high school days that I rarely mentioned to anyone. I stood there in front of these lockers, my heart rate increasing, my hands starting to shake slightly, and I tried to find some rational explanation for what I was seeing. Maybe Mike was just a common name, and this was all coincidence. Random graffiti that happened to cluster around my particular name for no meaningful reason. Maybe I was misreading the names, seeing patterns that weren't really there because I was tired, and my brain was making connections that didn't actually exist. Maybe this was some kind of weird joke or art project. Someone deliberately covering these lockers with one name to create exactly the kind of unease I was currently feeling. But none of these explanations felt right. None of them accounted for the specificity of some of the descriptions or the sheer improbability of this many variations of my name appearing in one place. I reached out and touched one of the lockers. The one that said Big Mike from Houston, and the metal was cold under my fingers, despite the warm air in the bathroom. Unnaturally cold, like it had been sitting in a freezer rather than a room temperature facility. I tried the handle, not really expecting it to open because these were coin-operated lockers that should be locked unless you'd paid for access. But the door swung open immediately, revealing the interior of the small storage space. Inside was a plastic bag, the kind of grocery bag you get from stores, and inside that bag I could see what looked like personal items, a wallet and keys and a cell phone, everyday objects that someone might temporarily store while using a facility like this. My hands were shaking harder now as I reached for the wallet, part of me screaming that I should just close the locker and leave. That investigating further was a mistake, that some doors are better left unopened. But curiosity and a deep need to understand what was happening made me pull out the wallet and open it. Looking at the driver's license visible through the plastic window, the photo on the license was of me, my face looking back at myself from that small laminated card. But the name on the license was Michael Patterson, not Michael Thompson, which is my actual name, and the address listed was in a city I'd never lived in, and the birth date was 2 years off from my real birth date. Close, but not quite right. I flipped through the other cards in the wallet, and found credit cards and insurance cards and a gym membership, all bearing the name Michael Patterson, all with variations on my information but never quite exactly matching my actual details. I dropped the wallet back into the bag like it had burned me, stumbling backward from the open locker, my breathing coming in short gasps that were veering toward hyperventilation. This wasn't right. This wasn't possible. This was something that violated every understanding I had of how reality worked. I looked at the other lockers, and with mounting horror, I realized that probably all of them contained similar items. personal effects from other versions of Mike, other variations on my existence, infinite possibilities stored in these small metal boxes in a Mississippi rest stop bathroom in the middle of the night. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the lockers, as if they might do something. Might open on their own, or their contents might spill out into the bathroom, might release all these alternative versions of myself into the world. My back hit the door, and I fumbled for the handle, got it open, and practically fell out into the night air, gasping like I'd been underwater and had just broken the surface. The parking lot looked normal, looked exactly as it had when I'd entered the bathroom maybe 5 minutes earlier, though time had become slippery and uncertain, and I couldn't be completely sure how long I'd been inside. My truck was still there, solid and real, and familiar, an anchor point in a reality that had just become deeply unstable and threatening. I stood there for several long minutes, trying to calm my breathing, trying to slow my racing heart, trying to decide what to do next. The sensible thing would be to just get back in my truck and leave. To continue my journey to Memphis and try to forget what I'd just seen, to dismiss it as a hallucination brought on by fatigue or stress or some kind of chemical imbalance. But another part of me, the part that needed to understand, that needed to solve puzzles and find explanations, urged me to go back inside, to examine the lockers more carefully, to gather evidence that would help me figure out what I'd encountered. In the end, fear won out over curiosity. I walked back to my truck, climbed into the cab, and started the engine, pulling out of the rest stop faster than was probably safe. Eager to put distance between myself and those lockers, with my name written on them in dozens of different hands. As I merged back onto the interstate and accelerated to highway speed, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see something following me, some manifestation of all those other Mikes whose belongings were stored in those lockers. But the road behind me remained empty, just normal darkness, and the occasional distant headlights of other vehicles going about their normal business. I completed my delivery to Memphis on schedule, and tried to convince myself over the following days that I'd imagined or misremembered what I'd seen, that exhaustion had created false memories or distorted real perceptions into something impossible. But the memory remained clear and vivid, refusing to fade or blur the way dreams and hallucinations usually do. And I knew that what I'd experienced had been real, in some sense, even if I couldn't explain it or make it fit into any framework of understanding I possessed. I've driven past that rest stop many times since, and I've never stopped there again, always pushing on to the next available facility even if it means waiting longer than is comfortable, because I don't want to go back into that bathroom and potentially see those lockers again. Don't want to be confronted once more with physical evidence that somehow there are other versions of me existing in other variations of reality, and that sometimes, in certain places under certain conditions, those parallel existences become visible or accessible. I've thought about it a lot, trying to understand what those lockers might mean, what they might represent. Maybe they're storage for alternate versions of people, places where the roads not taken keep their belongings, where the choices we didn't make store their artifacts. Maybe there's some kind of interdimensional lost and found, collecting items that fall through cracks in reality when parallel worlds briefly touch or overlap. Maybe they're warnings or messages, showing us that our identities are less fixed and singular than we like to believe, that we're all multiple possibilities collapsed into one current existence, but that those other possibilities don't entirely cease to exist. They just get stored somewhere, saved in lockers with our names on them, waiting for circumstances that might allow them to become actual again. They call me Big Mike, and I'm a practical man who maintains his equipment and follows regulations and doesn't believe in things that can't be explained or documented. And I've got a story about a rest stop where I found my name written on every locker, where I found personal effects from a version of myself who isn't me, but who could have been me if different choices had been made or different chances had been taken. I don't tell this story often because it sounds like the kind of thing someone invents to seem interesting or to get attention, and because talking about it brings back that feeling of profound unease, that sense that the stable singular identity I think of as myself is actually much more fragile and multiple than I want to believe. But it happened. I know it happened. And sometimes late at night, when I'm on the road and passing rest stops that look peaceful and ordinary in their pools of security light, I wonder if maybe all of them have similar secrets. All of them have back rooms or hidden secrets. All of them have back rooms or have back rooms of them spedums that don't stone have then stit see it gets stout in it. It gets to put in and bout and wit to menta and pal when I have been when it on the out if wicken to it to when I care if I to now if I to have it I where the excess and overflow of existence accumulates in lockers and closets and spaces between walls, waiting to be discovered by someone who happens to look at exactly the right moment, or who happens to have their name called out by coincidence or design from among all the infinite names that reality might have chosen to store. Story 10. The Woman Who Waves from the Ditch. From Highway Hank. They call me Highway Hank, a name I picked up early in my career, when someone commented that I seemed to know every highway and byway in the continental United States, that I could navigate from anywhere to anywhere without GPS or maps. Just an internal sense of where roads went and how they connected, an intuitive understanding of the transportation network that had come from thousands of hours studying at lessons and planning routes and actually driving those routes until they became part of my mental map of the world. I've been on the road for 23 years, running freight across the entire country, but specializing in the rural routes that connect small towns and agricultural areas to the larger distribution networks, the kind of driving that takes you off the interstates and onto two-lane highways that wind through farmland and forest, through communities that most people only know as names on exit signs, through landscapes that represent the real America that exists between the coastal cities and metropolitan centers that dominate news and culture. I haul mostly agricultural products and farm equipment, fertilizer and seed in the spring, produce and grain in summer and fall, machinery and parts year-round, following the rhythms of planting and harvest. My schedule dictated as much by weather and crop cycles as by customer demands or company policies. I've learned to read the land, to understand what the color of growing corn means about moisture levels, to predict harvest timing by watching soybeans progress through their growth stages, to gauge the year's success or failure by observing the height and health of wheat in the fields I pass. This work has given me an appreciation for the incredible complexity of modern agriculture, for the networks of equipment and chemicals and knowledge that allow relatively few people to feed an entire nation, for the skill and dedication of farmers who work impossible hours during critical periods, and who gamble everything on the cooperation of weather that becomes less predictable every year. But this work has also taken me to remote places, has put me on isolated roads at late hours, has placed me in situations where I'm the only person for miles, driving through darkness with nothing but my headlights to carve visibility from the night, passing through territories that feel empty of human presence, even though I know intellectually that people live here, work here, have entire lives that unfold in these spaces that to me are just passage, just the distance between departure and destination. And it was on one such remote road, late on a summer evening in rural Nebraska, that I had an encounter that I still think about regularly, that still makes me slow down when I'm driving similar roads, that still makes me look carefully at the ditches and shoulders, wondering if I might see her again. I was running a load of seed corn from a facility in Iowa up to a distribution center in South Dakota, taking the scenic route through Nebraska because construction on the more direct interstate route had created delays I didn't want to deal with. The highway I was following was perfectly maintained, but lightly traveled. 2 lanes cutting straight through endless fields of corn and soybeans, occasional farmsteads breaking the agricultural monotony with their clusters of buildings and trees. It was late July, that time of year when the crops are tall, and the days are long, and the evenings are warm, with the kind of thick humidity that makes sweat appear on your skin the moment you step out of air conditioning. The sun had set maybe half an hour earlier, and the twilight was that particular deep blue that comes just before full darkness, when you can still see landscape features, but colors are muted, and details are hard to distinguish. I was making good time. Cruise control set at exactly the speed limit, watching the road ahead and the fields on either side. Alert for deer or other animals that might decide to cross at exactly the wrong moment. Traffic was nearly non-existent, maybe one vehicle every 10 or 15 minutes passing in the other direction. Their headlights visible from far away on the straight flat road. I had my CB radio on but turned down low, just occasional static and the rare transmission from some other driver too far away for clear reception. The cab was comfortable, temperature set exactly where I liked it, my coffee still warm in its insulated mug, everything operating smoothly and efficiently. Just another normal evening on a normal route, nothing to suggest that anything unusual was about to happen. That's when I saw her for the first time, a woman standing in the ditch on the right side of the road, maybe 20 feet from the pavement, illuminated by my headlights as I approached. She was waving, not frantically or desperately, but just a casual wave. The kind of gesture you might make to acknowledge a friend passing by, or to signal hello to a neighbor. She was dressed in what looked like a summer dress. Though the light wasn't good enough to make out colors or specific details, and her posture was relaxed, not urgent, not indicating any kind of distress or emergency. As I passed her location, moving at 60 miles per hour, I looked in my mirror to see if there was a vehicle pulled over nearby, some indication that she was with someone, or that there was a reason for her to be standing out there in the gathering darkness. But there was nothing, no car visible, no house lights nearby, just empty road and empty fields, and the woman standing alone in the ditch, still waving though I'd already passed her, and was pulling away. My first instinct was to slow down, to turn around and go back, to check if she needed help, despite the casual nature of her wave. Because what kind of person would be standing alone out here for any good reason? But something stopped me, some instinct or intuition that I couldn't quite articulate, a feeling that going back would be a mistake, that despite appearances of normalcy, there was something wrong about this situation, something that my subconscious had recognized, even if my conscious mind hadn't yet processed what it was. I maintained my speed, kept moving forward, but I watched my mirrors carefully, half expecting to see her suddenly appear on the road behind me, or to see lights indicating another vehicle stopping to check on her. I'd driven maybe 2 miles farther, when I saw her again, standing in the ditch in exactly the same position, wearing the same dress, making the same casual wave as I approached. The shock of recognition made my hands tighten on the wheel, and my foot involuntarily lift from the accelerator, my speed dropping as my brain tried to process what I was seeing. There was no way the woman I'd passed 2 miles back could be here now, not unless she'd had a vehicle that had somehow passed me without my noticing, which seemed impossible on this straight empty road where I could see for miles in both directions. As I passed her for the second time, I stared hard, trying to memorize details, trying to confirm that this was indeed the same person. The resemblance was perfect, same approximate height and build, same dress, same posture, same wave, but the light was poor, and I was moving fast, and I couldn't be completely certain. This time I did slow down significantly, dropping to maybe 30 miles per hour, watching my mirrors intently to see what happened after I passed. The woman remained standing in the ditch, still waving, growing smaller in my mirror as I pulled away, and I could see no vehicle, no explanation for how she could be there. I considered stopping completely, considered getting on my CB and reporting this to someone, but who would I report it to, and what would I say that wouldn't sound absurd? There's a woman standing by the side of the road, waving at traffic, and I've seen her in 2 different places. That wasn't an emergency, wasn't even necessarily anything unusual, and any report I made would likely be dismissed as confusion or misidentification. I'd gone maybe another 3 miles. My attention completely focused on the right side of the road now. My speed down to 40 miles per hour as I watched for any sign of her appearing again, when I saw her for the 3rd time. Same location relative to the road, standing in the ditch about 20 feet from the pavement. Same posture, same dress, same wave. This time I was expecting it. This time I was looking for her. And the fact that I saw her again, despite my vigilant watching, somehow made it worse, made it more impossible, made it clear that whatever was happening here was not following any rules. I understood. I passed her again, and this time I counted, marking my odometer reading so I could measure exactly how far I traveled before seeing her the next time. She appeared again at the 3-mile mark, and then again at the 3-mile mark after that, and then again, and again. A repeating loop of the same woman, in the same position making the same gesture, appearing with mechanical regularity every 3 miles along this Nebraska highway. I drove through this sequence at least 15 times, maybe 20. The sun completely setting and darkness becoming total. My headlights the only illumination showing me this impossible sight repeating over and over. A woman who couldn't possibly be there standing in the ditch and waving as I passed. Eventually the repetitions stopped. I watched my odometer hit the next 3-mile mark and there was no woman. Just empty ditch and empty field. Normal roadside landscape with nothing unusual about it. I continued driving, gradually increasing my speed back to normal highway velocity, though I remained tense and alert, watching both sides of the road carefully, wondering if she might appear in some different location or in some different form. But the rest of that night's drive was completely normal, just standard rural highway conditions, and I reached my delivery destination without any further incidents. I've driven that same stretch of Nebraska highway many times since. Always during daylight when possible, but occasionally at night when schedules demand it, and I've never seen the woman again. The road looks perfectly ordinary, just typical agricultural landscape. Nothing that would suggest it's a place where impossible things happen. I've asked other drivers who run similar routes if they've ever seen anything strange in that area, described the woman and the location as precisely as I can without sounding completely unhinged, but nobody has reported similar experiences, or if they have, they're not willing to admit it to a relative stranger making casual inquiry. I've researched the area's history, looking for any stories that might provide context, any legends about ghostly women, or highway hauntings, or tragic accidents that might explain what I saw. I found some scattered references to a car accident in that general area years ago. A single vehicle crash that killed a young woman who'd been driving alone at night, her car leaving the road and rolling into a field where it wasn't discovered for several hours. The details were sparse, and the timing didn't quite match any anniversary or significant date related to when I saw the waving woman, but it was close enough to make me wonder if maybe what I'd witnessed was some kind of residual haunting, an echo of someone who died on that road repeating their last moments or their last attempt to signal for help over and over in an endless loop. Or maybe it wasn't a ghost at all, but something else. Some glitch in how reality operates along certain roads under certain conditions. A stuttering of space or time that causes the same scene to repeat at regular intervals, like a skipping record or a video stuck in a loop. Maybe I drove through some kind of field or distortion that was causing my perception to malfunction, showing me the same image multiple times, even though it only existed once, my brain somehow receiving the same visual signal repeatedly as I traveled through whatever was causing the effect. They call me Highway Hank, and I know these roads better than I know almost anything else. And I've got a story about a woman who waves from ditches in Nebraska, who appears every 3 miles with perfect regularity, who stands alone in the darkness wearing a summer dress and making a gesture that could be greeting or warning or goodbye. I don't know who she is, don't know if she's human or ghost or illusion or something else entirely, don't know if she needs help or if she's trying to provide warning or if she's just there, a fixture of that particular stretch of highway, visible to some drivers under some conditions, for reasons that might never be understood. But I saw her multiple times in a sequence that can't be explained by normal means, and I remember her every time I drive through empty rural areas at twilight. Remember that sometimes the ditches hide to ditch, that sometimes people, that sometimes peepee then something main beepee and plea when with beep you to be play and be some and pew and print be and pin with ba mail. I'm it in it's to evaporate it but it the pit to with it with it or Rawat makeup, yard dead hood, that would the source, the sounds that and that the roads we think we know might contain mysteries that our knowledge can't encompass or explain. Story 11. The Road That Whispers Back. From Freightliner Frank. They call me Freightliner Frank, a name that's less creative than some, but that's stuck, because I've been loyal to one truck manufacturer for my entire career. Always driving Freightliners, always trusting their engineering and reliability. Developing over the years, a deep familiarity with how these particular machines handle and sound and respond to different conditions and demands. I've been on the road for 31 years now. Started driving when I was just 21 years old and fresh out of technical school where I'd studied diesel mechanics, but discovered I preferred operating the machines to fixing them, preferred the motion and freedom of the highway to the static routine of a shop bay. I run primarily the Mountain West, Colorado and Wyoming and Montana, occasionally venturing into Utah or Idaho or the Dakotas, occasionally owning Scarial or the Chains, carrying Scarials. Carrying equipment, mining equipment, Miley Excelleds, Heli Sully Beelies, heavy loads killable of skillabs, and the busy is skillets clee that is skin to where that skin squale and been stewed to with pulek skin and with in the in it in it and it so to it pillow at it I will at all at now the go will up The mountain routes I run are some of the most beautiful and most challenging in the country. Passes that wind through peaks still capped with snow in July. Valleys carved by rivers that run cold and clear from glacial sources. Stretches of highway where you can see for 50 miles in every direction and still feel dwarfed by the immensity of the landscape. The sheer scale of geology that makes human presence feel temporary and insignificant. I've driven through every season these mountains can produce, from summer days when wildflowers carpet the meadows and the sky is so blue it seems artificial, through autumn when the aspens turn gold and entire mountainsides look like they're on fire with color, through winters when the snow falls in quantities measured in feet and the wind creates drifts that can bury entire vehicles, through springs when the snowmelt turns every creek into a torrent and the roads are damaged by frost heave and the endless cycle of freezing and thawing. But for all the dramatic weather and spectacular scenery, the thing I remember most vividly from these decades of mountain driving happened on a perfectly ordinary spring evening on a stretch of highway in southern Wyoming, a road I'd driven hundreds of times before, a route that held no particular significance or reputation for being unusual or problematic. It was late May, that perfect time in the mountains when the snow has mostly melted from all but the highest elevations, when the air is cool but not cold and the days are long and the light has a particular clarity that makes distances hard to judge and colors seem more saturated than they should be. I was hauling drilling equipment from a fabrication facility in Colorado up to an oil field in Montana, running ahead of schedule for once, no particular pressure or stress, just a routine haul on a familiar road under good conditions. The highway I was following wound through high desert country. Not quite mountain terrain, but elevated enough that the landscape had that spare quality that comes from limited precipitation and harsh winters, sage and scrub grass and occasional stands of juniper. The kind of country that looks empty at first glance, but that reveals surprising amounts of life, if you pay attention. Hawks riding thermals and antelope grazing in small herds, and ground squirrels darting between burrows. The road itself was well maintained, 2 lanes with adequate shoulders. Not much traffic at this hour, which was approaching twilight, the sun dropping toward the western horizon and painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink and purple that would have seemed impossible if they weren't right there in front of me, real and undeniable. I had my window cracked slightly, letting in the cool, evening air, preferring the natural ventilation to the recycled atmosphere of the air conditioning when conditions allowed. The smell of sage was strong, that particular sharp green scent that characterizes this landscape, mixed with the mineral smell of dry earth and the faint sweetness of whatever small plants were blooming in the ditches and on the hillsides. My radio was off, no CB chatter to distract me, no music or news or talk shows, just the sound of my engine and tires and wind, the natural soundtrack of driving that I'd always found more relaxing than any artificial entertainment. That's when I first heard the whisper. It was quiet, almost below the threshold of audibility, a sound that could easily have been mistaken for wind, or tire noise, or some subtle engine harmonic. But there was something about it that caught my attention, something that made me turn down my fan and listen more carefully, trying to isolate the sound from the background noise of travel. It came again, definitely a whisper, definitely human, or at least human-like in its characteristics, though I couldn't make out any words, couldn't distinguish actual language from the susurrus of breath and soft consonants that constitute whispering. I checked my mirrors reflexively, making sure there wasn't somehow another person in the cab with me, which was absurd, because I'd been alone when I started this trip, and I'd been alone at my last stop, and there was no possible way anyone could have gotten into my truck without me noticing. The sleeper berth was empty, visible through the gap in the curtain, just my bunk and my gear, no unexpected passengers hiding back there. I was definitely alone, which meant the whispering was either coming from outside the truck somehow, carried in through the cracked window, or I was imagining it, creating patterns from random noise, because that's what human brains do. They find signals in static, whether those signals actually exist or not. But the whispering continued, and as I listened more carefully, I started to realize that it was coming from outside. Not from any direction I could pinpoint, but from everywhere simultaneously. From the road itself, perhaps, from the landscape, from the air moving past the truck. And more disturbing than the presence of the sound was the growing certainty that it was responding to me, to my thoughts, to the internal monologue that runs constantly in my head during long drives. I'd been thinking about my route, mentally reviewing the remaining distance and planned stops, and the whispering seemed to echo these thoughts, repeating fragments of my internal planning in that same soft breath and consonant voice. ... Next fuel stop ... Montana border. Check tire pressure ... I felt my heart rate increase, felt that cold sensation of fear beginning to creep up my spine, because this was wrong in ways that violated fundamental assumptions about how the world works. I decided to test it, to think something specific, and see if the whispering responded. So I deliberately formed the thought, "What are you?" in my mind, clear and distinct, and I listened carefully to see what would happen. The whisper came back almost immediately. "What are you? What are you? What are you?" Repeating my question back to me, in that soft voice that seemed to come from the road, or the air, or the space between things. A voice that had no source I could identify, but that was undeniably present and audible. I tried speaking out loud, saying hello. "Who's there?" in a voice that sounded steadier than I felt, and again the whisper responded, echoing my words back with a delay of maybe a second or two. "Hello, who's there? Hello, who's there?" Like an echo, but not quite an echo. More like repetition, like something was learning my words by repeating them, trying to understand language by mimicking the sounds it heard. I experimented with this for several minutes, speaking various phrases, and listening to them come back to me in whispers. The responses always slightly delayed, always exact repetitions of what I'd said, but stripped of inflection and emotion, just the bare phonetic content delivered in that soft, breathy voice. Then the whispers started to change, started to include things I hadn't said or thought recently. started pulling from deeper memory or from knowledge I possessed but wasn't actively thinking about. I heard my ex-wife's name whispered, heard the name of the town where I grew up, heard specific details about events from years ago, childhood memories and adult regrets and fears I'd never voiced to anyone, all coming back to me in whispers that seemed to know things they shouldn't know, that seemed to have access to information stored in my mind in places I didn't regularly visit or examine. The whispers weren't threatening exactly, weren't malicious or hostile in their tone, but there was something deeply invasive about them, something that felt like violation, like something was rummaging through my memories and thoughts without permission, pulling out pieces and examining them and whispering them back to me to show that it could. I tried closing the window completely, shutting out the external air, but the whispers continued unabated, no quieter for the barrier between inside and outside, suggesting they weren't actually coming through the window, but were somehow present in the cab with me, despite having no visible source. I tried turning on my radio loudly, flooding the cab with sound to drown out the whispers, but I could still hear them underneath the music or talk, still present and persistent, still pulling fragments from my thoughts and memories, and speaking them back to me in that soft, incessant voice. The experience was profoundly unsettling, not because the whispers were saying anything particularly disturbing in content, but because of what they represented, evidence that something was accessing my inner life. Something was reading my thoughts and memories, and using them to communicate with me, or demonstrate its presence, or accomplish some purpose I couldn't understand. I thought about pulling over, about stopping the truck, and getting out and walking away from this situation. But where would I go, and what good would it do, if the whispers were somehow following me, rather than coming from a fixed location? And part of me was afraid that stopping would make things worse, that movement was somehow protecting me, that as long as I kept driving, I maintained some kind of safety or distance from whatever was causing this. The whispers continued for what felt like hours, but what my clock told me was maybe 45 minutes. A constant stream of soft voices repeating my thoughts and pulling fragments from my memory. Sometimes speaking things I'd recently been thinking and sometimes dredging up material from years or decades past, creating a disorienting collage of my own mental content reflected back at me from an unknown source. Then, gradually, the whispers began to fade, not stopping abruptly, but becoming quieter and less frequent, the intervals between them growing longer, until finally they were gone completely, and I was left with just the normal sounds of my truck and the road and the evening air moving past. I drove the rest of that night in silence, not willing to turn on the radio or open the window or do anything that might invite the whispers to return. I completed my delivery to Montana on schedule and spent the next several days trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that fatigue or stress or some kind of auditory hallucination had created the experience out of nothing, that it hadn't been real, despite how vivid and detailed it had seemed. But I knew better, knew that what I'd experienced had been real, in some sense, even if it couldn't be explained by normal mechanisms. Knew that something had been there with me on that Wyoming highway, something that could read thoughts and memories, and could communicate by whispering them back in a voice that came from nowhere. I've driven that same stretch of highway many times since, always with a mixture of nervousness and curiosity, always wondering if the whispers will return, if whatever caused them is still there waiting for the right conditions or the right driver to manifest again. Most of the time the drive is completely normal, just another piece of familiar road with nothing unusual about it. But occasionally I'll think I hear something, a faint whisper just at the edge of audibility, and I'll go quiet and listen carefully, trying to determine if it's real or if my memory of that night is making me perceive sounds that aren't actually there. I've researched that stretch of highway, looking for any history that might explain what I experienced. Any legends about voices or ghosts, or unusual phenomena. I found some scattered references to Native American beliefs about spirits in the landscape, about places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds is thin, about sounds that carry messages from ancestors or from the land itself. I found modern accounts of other drivers reporting strange experiences in Wyoming's high desert country, though nothing that exactly matched what I'd encountered. I found scientific explanations for how wind and terrain can create acoustic effects that seem to produce voices or music, how the human brain can interpret random noise as speech patterns, how fatigue and isolation can create auditory hallucinations that feel completely real. But none of these explanations quite fit what I experienced. None of them account for the specificity of the content, the way the whispers accessed information from my memory that I wasn't actively thinking about, the way they responded to my thoughts and questions with apparent understanding and intention. What I heard wasn't random noise interpreted as speech. It was actual speech, with actual content, information that could only have come from inside my own head being spoken back to me by something external. Something that for 45 minutes had access to my inner life and used that access to communicate its presence. They call me Freightliner Frank, and I've been driving mountain roads for more than 3 decades. And I've got a story about a highway that whispers, about a stretch of Wyoming road where something exists that can read thoughts and speak them back in voices that come from nowhere, where the boundary between internal and external becomes permeable, and your private thoughts become public in the strangest possible way. I don't know what it was, don't know if it was some natural phenomenon that science could explain if only the right experts studied it, or if it was something supernatural, something that exists outside our normal understanding of how reality operates. But I know it happened. No, I heard those whispers and recognized my own thoughts and memories in them, and I carry that experience with me every time I drive through empty country. Every time I find myself alone on a quiet highway with nothing but my thoughts for company, wondering if maybe those thoughts aren't as private as I assume, wondering if maybe those thoughts aren't as private as I assume, wondering if maybe there are platering if matering entering is mettering wondering entering is mentering peering on wondering with exern and wondering when with it been well it to care it with it to where thoughts become sounds, where the road itself learns to speak by listening to what passes over it and whispering it back to those who follow. Story 12. The Moon That Never Sets. From Ghost Gear, Gary. They call me Ghost Gear Gary, a nickname I acquired after developing a reputation for being able to coax extra performance from old equipment, keeping trucks running that should have been retired years ago, finding gears and handling characteristics in machines that their manufacturers probably never intended. I got the ghost part because other drivers swore they could hear my truck shifting through gears that didn't technically exist, phantom ratios between the documented transmission settings, my rig somehow finding power and efficiency in spaces that shouldn't be there according to the specifications and manuals. I've been driving for 27 years, running primarily night routes because I've always been a night person, someone who comes alive after the sun goes down, who finds peace and focus in the hours when most people are sleeping and the world is quiet, and the roads are empty of the daytime chaos of commuters and casual travelers. I haul times, sensitive freight, medical supplies and perishable goods, and anything else that needs to arrive quickly and reliably, running routes that often require me to drive straight through without stopping beyond brief fuel and food breaks, maximizing velocity and minimizing transit time. This work has made me intimately familiar with night driving, with the particular challenges and pleasures of moving through darkness, with the way landscapes transform under stars or moonlight, or the artificial glow of distant cities reflected off clouds. I've seen more sunrises and sunsets than most people see in several lifetimes, watched the sky cycle through its full range of colors and moods from the unique perspective of someone who's always moving, always transitioning between locations, never staying in one place long enough to see a full day pass from a stationary viewpoint. But last autumn, running a load of refrigerated pharmaceuticals from Arizona up to Oregon, I experienced something with the moon that I still can't explain. Something that violated basic astronomy and made me question whether the sky operates according to rules I don't understand, or whether I'd somehow driven into a pocket of reality where normal celestial mechanics didn't apply. It was mid-October, that perfect time of year in the southwest, when the brutal summer heat has finally broken, but winter cold hasn't yet arrived, when nights are cool and clear, and the air has a crystalline quality that makes stars seem brighter and closer than they appeared during other seasons. I'd left Phoenix around 6 in the evening, planning to drive straight through to Portland. Roughly 17 hours of driving time, not counting stops. A haul I'd done many times before, and that held no particular challenges beyond staying alert and maintaining focus for the duration. The first few hours were still light, the long autumn sunset providing visibility well into the early evening, but by the time I crossed into Nevada, full darkness had fallen, and I'd switched over to my night driving routine. Windows cracked for fresh air, temperature set slightly cooler than I'd keep it during the day. Radio off to reduce sensory stimulation and help maintain the calm, focused state that long night drives require. The moon rose around 10 o'clock, coming up over the eastern horizon as a perfect circle, full, or perhaps just one night away from full. Large and orange, the way moons always appear when they're close to the horizon and being viewed through maximum atmosphere. I watched it rise with the appreciation of someone who's seen thousands of moonrises, noting its beauty while simultaneously using it as a navigation aid, a reference point that would track across the sky over the coming hours, providing light and orientation as I traveled north through Nevada's empty spaces. By midnight I'd crossed into Oregon, still making good time, and I noticed the moon was now high in the sky, almost directly overhead, appearing smaller than it had at moonrise, but brilliantly white, casting enough light that I could see the landscape clearly even away from my headlights, the high desert terrain rendered in shades of silver and deep shadow. This was all completely normal. Exactly what should happen as the moon follows its arc across the sky from east to west, rising in the east and eventually setting in the west as Earth's rotation carries observers through the lunar phases of visibility. But around 2 in the morning, I noticed something strange. The moon was still directly overhead, still in that same position it had been in several hours earlier, still casting the same brilliant white light across the landscape. At first I thought I must be mistaken about how much time had passed, but my dashboard clock was clear and unambiguous, and my position relative to landmarks and mile markers confirmed that several hours had indeed elapsed since I'd last paid conscious attention to the moon's position. I watched it carefully for the next hour, glancing up through the windshield periodically while maintaining my focus on the road, and the moon didn't move, didn't progress in its normal westward arc, just stayed fixed in that overhead position as if it had been pinned to the sky, as if the normal rules of celestial motion had been suspended. By 3:30 in the morning, I was becoming genuinely unsettled. The moon should have been noticeably closer to the western horizon by now, should have been descending toward its eventual setting, but it remained overhead, unchanging, a fixed point in the sky that violated everything I knew about how moons and planets and celestial objects behave. I pulled over at a rest area, got out of my truck, and stood in the parking lot staring up at the sky, confirming what I'd been seeing through the windshield. The moon was definitely overhead, definitely stationary relative to the stars around it, which were themselves moving normally in the slow rotation that comes from Earth's spin, the constellations gradually shifting position as the night progressed, while the moon stayed fixed like someone had glued it to the dome of the sky. I stood there for perhaps 15 minutes, just watching, trying to understand what I was seeing. Other stars moved perceptibly if you watched long enough. The entire celestial sphere rotating slowly around Polaris, the North Star that appears stationary because it's aligned with Earth's rotational axis. But the moon, which should be moving with that rotation, which should be tracking westward at an easily observable rate, was simply not moving at all. It stayed perfectly positioned overhead, its illuminated face unchanging, its brightness constant, a violation of natural law that was so complete and undeniable that I found myself questioning whether I'd somehow lost my mind, whether some kind of neurological problem was causing me to misperceive or misremember the passage of time and position. But my phone confirmed the time, and my truck's systems confirmed my location, and the progression of mile markers and landmarks confirmed that I was indeed traveling. That time was indeed passing, that I hadn't somehow become stuck in a temporal loop or experienced some massive gap in consciousness. Everything was proceeding normally, except for the moon, which had apparently decided to violate the fundamental mechanics of orbital motion and just hang there in the sky above me, refusing to set, refusing to move, refusing to behave the way moons have behaved for the entire history of Earth, and probably for the entire history of the universe. I got back in my truck and continued driving. My attention now divided between the road and the sky, constantly checking to see if the moon would resume its normal motion, or if this impossible stasis would continue. Hours passed. 4 o'clock became 5 o'clock became 6 o'clock, and dawn should have been approaching. The eastern sky should have been starting to lighten with the first hints of sunrise, but the darkness remained complete. The stars remained visible, and the moon remained fixed overhead, as if night had decided to just continue indefinitely, as if morning had been cancelled or postponed, or simply wasn't going to happen. By 6:30 I was approaching genuine fear. Not just confusion or concern, but actual terror at the implications of what I was experiencing. If the moon wasn't moving, if sunrise wasn't happening, then something fundamental about how the universe operates had broken or changed, and I couldn't imagine what might cause such a change, or what other effects it might have. Was this happening everywhere, or just in my location? Were other people seeing this, or was it somehow specific to me? Had Earth stopped rotating? And if so, why was I still able to drive normally? Why weren't there massive geological and atmospheric catastrophes happening as the sudden cessation of rotation would inevitably cause? I tried my phone, thinking to call someone to check if this was a widespread phenomenon, but I had no signal, which wasn't unusual in this remote part of Oregon, but which felt ominous given everything else that was happening. I tried my CB radio and got only static, no voices. No indication that any other drivers were out there experiencing the same thing, or that the normal world of human communication was still functioning beyond my immediate sphere of perception. Then, at 7 o'clock, according to my dashboard clock, something changed. The moon began to move, not in the normal westward progression it should have been following all along, but directly downward, descending straight down from its overhead position toward the northern horizon in a motion that was impossible, that violated both the moon's actual orbit and the apparent motion created by Earth's rotation. It moved quickly, noticeably, crossing perhaps 30 degrees of sky in the span of maybe 5 minutes, and as it descended the sky around it began to lighten, not with the gradual progression of normal dawn, but suddenly, as if someone was turning up a dimmer switch, the darkness lifting and being replaced by the blue-gray light of pre-dawn twilight. By 7:15, the moon had set below the northern horizon, which was wrong because moons don't set in the north. They set in the west following their rise from the east. But this moon had apparently decided that normal rules didn't apply and had chosen its own path, and as soon as it disappeared below the horizon, dawn proceeded normally. The eastern sky lighting up with the familiar colors of sunrise, the sun appearing where it should appear, and when it should appear, normal celestial mechanics apparently resuming now that the moon had finished its impossible journey and removed itself from visibility. I continued driving in a state of numb confusion, completing my delivery to Portland on schedule, going through the motions of unloading and paperwork and signing documentation while my mind kept replaying what I'd witnessed, kept trying to find some explanation that would make sense. I looked up astronomical data for that date, confirming that the moon had indeed been full, or nearly full, confirming what the rise and set times should have been according to normal orbital mechanics, and finding that what I'd experienced bore no relationship to those predictions. The moon should have risen around sunset and set around sunrise, should have followed its normal east to west arc across the southern sky, should have behaved exactly the way moons always behave when the physics of orbital motion are operating normally. I've thought about it constantly since then. trying to understand what happened, trying to determine if there's any possible explanation that fits within known science. Could I have experienced some kind of prolonged hallucination or false memory? Could there have been atmospheric conditions that created an optical illusion making the moon appear stationary when it was actually moving normally? Could I have had some kind of temporal perception disorder that made hours feel like minutes and made motion appear as stasis? None of these explanations feel adequate. None of them account for the specific details of what I observed. The way the moon eventually moved downward in an impossible direction. The way dawn was delayed beyond its scheduled time and then suddenly appeared when the moon finally set. I've talked to other drivers who run similar routes, carefully describing what I saw without making it sound too crazy, trying to gauge if anyone else has experienced similar phenomena. Most of them just look at me like I need more sleep or possibly psychological evaluation. But one older driver, a woman who's been on night routes even longer than I have, got a particular look in her eyes and said quietly that sometimes the sky doesn't work quite right, especially in certain locations and under certain conditions, that the celestial mechanics we take for granted are more flexible than we like to believe, and that some nights the moon decides to do its own thing regardless of what astronomy says should be happening. They call me Ghost Gear Gary, and I drive the night routes where most people never go, where the world belongs to freight haulers and insomniacs and the few other souls who prefer darkness to daylight. And I've got a story about a moon that refused to set, about a night that stretched beyond its natural boundaries, about several hours when the normal progression of celestial objects was suspended and something impossible took its place. I don't know why it happened or what it means. Don't know if I drove through some pocket of space where different physical laws apply, or if I experienced some kind of cosmic glitch where the programs that run reality stuttered and skipped and had to restart. But I know what I saw. No, I watched that moon stay fixed overhead for hours when it should have been moving. No, I saw it eventually descend in a direction that moons don't go before sunrise finally arrived and restored normal order to the sky. And now every night when I'm driving and I see the moon rise and track across the sky in its expected arc, I watch it a little more carefully than I used to, paying attention to its motion, making sure it's behaving the way it should, wondering if maybe tonight will be another night when the rules change and the moon decides to write its own story across the sky, leaving drivers like me to witness the impossible and carry the memory of it forward into a world that mostly doesn't believe such things are possible.